In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Măceșanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Ce urgență aveți? Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
nu vă numiți.
Sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sechestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Măceșanu, Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal, m-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un de reper unde te afli în Caracal, cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old, dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found, and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandra Măceșanu, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Gheorghe Dincă, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Gheorghe as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Gheorghe's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Gheorghe himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure.
His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Gheorghe started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Gheorghe returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal. Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Gheorghe say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Gheorghe Dincă was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Gheorghe confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Luisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Luisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Luisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dincă was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Luisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Luisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Luisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Luisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Luisa's grandfather, assuring him that Luisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Luisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the 4th day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Luisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Luisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Măceșanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the two murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Louisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Gheorghe stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Louisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Gheorghe was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Louisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Gheorghe intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the two murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than two bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Gheorghe began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Louisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Gheorghe also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Gheorghe clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Gheorghe said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Gheorghe agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Gheorghe lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Gheorghe's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louisa's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Gheorghe was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Gheorghe suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luisa refused to believe that Gheorghe killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Gheorghe of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Gheorghe might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Gheorghe, but Alexandra's mother and Luisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Gheorghe might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Gheorghe's car was connected to Luisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Gheorghe's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Gheorghe hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Gheorghe Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Gheorghe had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Gheorghe's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Gheorghe's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Gheorghe most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Gheorghe was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the Caracal monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Gheorghe was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repețianu, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Gheorghe once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victims' relatives will never be able to forget what happened. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister, Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store, since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman getting into a van with a baby. They approached and explained the situation. On Saturday, April 5, 1997, the dispatcher of the Las Vegas, Nevada Rescue Service answered a call from a distressed man who reported the disappearance of his wife. The man, identified as Mark Hollinger, explained that his wife's name was Ginger Rios. They had been married for only 5 months and had just moved into a new house. Yesterday, they were shopping for their new home when Ginger entered a store and seemed to vanish into thin air. The police began an investigation. Detectives had never heard of a person disappearing so mysteriously, even in a city with its share of sins. They couldn't even begin to imagine how unusual this case would turn out to be, where you think you know exactly what happened, but it turns out you don't, and you have to start all over again. 20-year-old Ginger Rios lived and worked in Las Vegas. Her parents, George and Denise, adored their daughters, Ginger and her younger sister Daniela. The girls grew up surrounded by attention and care. Since childhood, Ginger dreamt of performing on stage, and she was fortunate to be born in Las Vegas because by the age of 20, she became a member of a successful group that performed in casino hotels. She also met a man named Mark Hollinger, who was 14 years older than her. Mark treated Ginger exceptionally well. He supported her in everything, and soon the young couple decided to legalize their relationship. In November 1996, when Ginger was only 20 and Mark was 34, they tied the knot. Some considered their union unusual because Ginger was a cheerful extrovert, while Mark was a quiet introvert. But they complemented each other perfectly and were already planning how to build their family nest. In the spring of 1997, Ginger found an amazing house available for rent with an option to buy. The house had a spacious basement, and Ginger could already imagine turning it into a dance studio. She liked the house so much that she dreamed of eventually purchasing it. However, to realize this dream, she and Mark needed a positive credit history. They needed a clear plan for how they would manage their finances, and for this purpose, Ginger wanted to buy books with relevant recommendations. In the city, a shop was gaining popularity that sold exactly the kind of books Ginger was looking for. It had a quirky name, Spy Shop. It was like a candy store for adults. In addition to books, its shelves held lockpicks, hidden surveillance cameras, police badges, car alarms, glasses that transmitted images, and even tools for removing store security tags from clothing. It was conveniently located in the city center. And so, on Friday, April 4th, literally the day after the young couple had moved into their new home, they went shopping, including for books. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark parked directly in front of the entrance. Ginger told her husband to wait in the car, and she took her wallet, which had some cash and her identification, and went inside. Mark expected her to come out very quickly, but he managed to finish his cigarette, and she still hadn't appeared. Thinking she might be waiting in line, he waited a little longer and then decided to check on his wife. The shop was small enough that he immediately realized Ginger was not there. He asked the man and woman behind the counter if they had seen Ginger and described her, of course. They replied that she had just come in, bought 2 books, and left. They added that she couldn't have gone far. Mark was surprised, but decided to look around in other stores, thinking maybe she needed to buy something else. He went into each one and asked if anyone had seen a slender brunette, but no one had seen her. His amazement knew no bounds. The car was parked right in front of the entrance. She couldn't have just slipped past it. Ginger had simply disappeared in broad daylight. Not knowing what else to do, Mark went to his wife's parents. Ginger's father, George, immediately thought that if there were surveillance cameras in any store, it would certainly be in the spy shop. They might be able to see at least which direction she went after leaving the store, since this shop not only stood out for its unique items, but also closed earlier. Compared to other places in Vegas, Mark and George hurried back in the hope that the storekeeper hadn't left yet. Unfortunately, the shop was closed, but Mark managed to identify the man and the woman. They decided to take it for analysis just in case. Rosgen got in touch with John Flowers to inform him that the police had visited his store. John was quite surprised that they hadn't found the girl yet, but readily answered all the questions. He explained that the bleach smell in the storeroom was because his dog used it as a toilet, and he had to clean up after it frequently. It was possible that's how a tiny drop of blood ended up there. As for the surveillance camera footage and the receipts for the book purchases, he would need to come to the store to look for them and hand them over to the police. Rosgen asked about the books Ginger bought, and this is where the surprise came in. One book was about creating a new identity, and the other was about contract killers. But why did Ginger buy these? Did she genuinely intend to disappear? Or did someone force her to buy these books and then kill her in one of the ways described in the second book? The tiny spot on the wall, possibly blued, turned out to be too small for analysis. Nevertheless, it wasn't very important since everyone already knew Ginger had been in the store and left. What was much more critical was figuring out where she went afterward. Indeed, there were several possible leads, especially considering Ginger's striking beauty and her public performances. Many people, including those with bad intentions, could have noticed her. Moreover, her father worked as a dealer in one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. When it comes to money, things can get messy. Days turned into weeks, and the hope of finding the girl alive was dwindling. The answer regarding Mark's car came, and guess what? They found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing at all. At this point, Rosgen thought of John Flowers. He considered the possibility of checking the surveillance camera footage to see if someone had approached Ginger at the store's exit. However, he was too late. Exclaiming, "Where have you been all this time, guys?" John explained that he had reviewed the footage, saw Ginger entering the store, choosing the books, paying in cash, and leaving. Since no one had come for the video, it had been overwritten with new footage from the surveillance camera. John also couldn't find the receipt for the books, although he was certain that it should be somewhere. After this, John seemed unwilling to cooperate further with the detective, partly because his business had suffered due to police, media, and curious onlookers who crowded his shop after Ginger's disappearance. Selling lockpicks and fake police badges in a store that was already filled with law enforcement paraphernalia was understandable, but it put immense pressure on his small business. Rosgen understood this, and there was nothing to push John into talking with them. The case was put on the back burner, and the police had no new leads. In fact, the truth was there, but the detectives working on Ginger's case wouldn't discover it until several more months passed. On May 5th, in the Mojave Desert, nearly 400 miles from Vegas, a group of hunters stumbled upon a shallow grave. The medical examiner determined that the body in the grave belonged to a young, dark-haired girl aged 15 to 18. She had no identification on her, but the killer hadn't taken her quite distinctive jewelry, a pink ring with 3 colored stones and another ring shaped like wire loops, intertwined to form the letter M or W. Could the M signify Mark? Or perhaps it was a family heirloom, because Ginger's mother's maiden name was Watersworth. Hoping for public assistance, the local police published photos of the jewelry, but it would be a very long time before they would learn the truth. In the meantime, to crack the case, the detectives needed a lead or a body. Suddenly, on August 16, 1997, Jeff Rosgen received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as a federal agent from Arizona and claimed to have a lead on the Ginger case. Rosgen was intrigued. The agent explained that John Flowers had been accused of selling illegal eavesdropping devices. But what did this have to do with Ginger? The agent continued. John had gone on the run because he didn't want to be arrested, but his wife, Cheryl Cizone, had been brought in for questioning. They were interested in her husband's whereabouts, but suddenly she started talking about Ginger Rios, who had disappeared in Vegas several months ago. The agent left the room to make a call to Rosgen. It was only now that Rosgen realized he had never formally questioned the owner of the spy shop, the last place Ginger was seen. And yet, Ginger's husband had mentioned that there was a man and a woman behind the counter. Rosgen asked the agents not to let Cheryl out of their sight and hurried to Arizona. Rosgen couldn't have anticipated what Cheryl's interrogation would reveal. When Ginger entered the shop to browse for books, John Flowers turned to Cheryl and asked her to go buy film. This wasn't unusual, as she often ran errands when they worked together at the store. Cheryl returned after about 10 minutes, and that's when Mark walked in. John told Mark that his wife had just left and couldn't have gone far. Mark thanked them and left. Cheryl's husband seemed like a different person. He had a terrified look on his face. She asked him what was going on, and the man replied, "I did something terrible. Whatever you do, don't go into the storage room." Cheryl had no idea what he meant, and it never occurred to her that her husband had harmed someone. However, his behavior unsettled her, and a little while later, she decided to check the storage room. Inside, she found the lifeless body of a young girl with a pool of blood surrounding her head. The carpet was also soaked in blood. The girl had been brutally beaten. It was the same girl who had entered the shop before John had sent Cheryl to get film. Cheryl felt disgusted, but her disgust quickly turned into fear when she realized John was right behind her. She hadn't even turned around when he grabbed her by the neck and ordered her never to speak about what had happened there, or something bad would happen to her as well as their child. Cheryl obeyed his command, but now that John was on the run, she decided to tell the truth. The detective wanted to know how John explained the situation to Cheryl. John told her that Ginger had a note from 2 of his former employees who were demanding money. Supposedly, the contents of the note and Ginger's insolence had infuriated John, and he had hit her so hard in the face that she fell back, hit her head, and died. However, Cheryl was convinced that this was a lie, and she had never seen the note. She did know for sure that John had taken garbage bags and spent several hours in the storage room, wrapping the girl's body in plastic bags and pouring bleach around her. He had told the employee that the dog had used the room as a restroom. Then, he put the body in his van and told Cheryl they needed to leave for Arizona immediately. That's when Ginger's father and husband approached them and pleaded for them to show the surveillance camera footage. John and Cheryl looked them in the eyes and lied, even though Ginger was lying just inches away from them. But that's not all. Cheryl also knew where her husband had buried the body. You see, they had gone to the Mojave Desert several times, John and Cheryl together. One time, John left Cheryl in the middle of nowhere and drove off with their baby and the girl's body. It's clear that he buried her, returned for Cheryl, and drove home. But this wasn't enough for him. They went to that location several more times so John could hide the shallow grave under a layer of concrete. It was only the last time that John came running back panicked and screaming, "They found her! They found her!" So Cheryl was quite certain that the police had already discovered Ginger's body. In any case, she agreed to show the detectives the location in exchange for no charges being filed against her. They accepted her offer because they didn't believe Cheryl had been involved in the murder. She led them to the spot. When they arrived in the desert, the local officers started connecting the dots between the body found by hunters in May and Cheryl's revelation. Cheryl asked them to stop the car and led them to the place her husband had visited. The police expected to find an empty grave, but instead, they reached a concrete slab that appeared untouched. There, they discovered the body wrapped in plastic bags. Thanks to a tattoo on the lower back, they had a preliminary identification as Ginger, but they decided to wait for DNA analysis before informing her family. This raised several unanswered questions. Were there two victims? Did John kill both? If so, why and who was the second girl? Now they could secure a search warrant for the Vegas store where they found traces of Ginger's blood. The DNA analysis later confirmed that the body in the desert also belonged to her. Mark, who had clung to the hope that his wife had simply left and started a new life, was devastated. He blamed himself, thinking he should have gone to the store with her. But how could he have imagined that a complete stranger, the owner of a popular and frequently visited store, would attack his wife, someone who was a mother and his loving spouse? John's attempt to hide didn't last long, and he was arrested at a hotel in Los Angeles. The extradition process began, during which the detectives discovered that there was no John Flowers, the owner of the spy store's chain. Instead, there was a 26-year-old Craig Jacobson wanted for crimes committed in Florida. From the age of 10, the boy had struggled with mental health issues, suffering from paranoia, borderline personality disorder, and likely antisocial personality disorder. He spent a year in a mental health clinic and then served 30 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. However, in 1995, he disappeared. In his place, John emerged. In addition to this revelation, the police found another potential victim of John or Craig. 2 months prior, a teenage girl had entered the Vegas store, but before she could even browse the merchandise, the owner approached her, slung her over his shoulder, and carried her into the storeroom without uttering a word. Her luck was incredible because another customer entered the store and scared John Flowers away, so he released her. This young woman didn't report the incident to the police out of fear, and her word against the word of a respected businessman could have been problematic. This, of course, was before the truth about John came to light. In the following months, psychiatrists examined him multiple times and deemed him unfit to stand trial. The prosecutor was convinced that Craig was faking it, but feared that the crime might go unpunished. He explained to Ginger's family that the best option would be to offer him a plea deal. Craig agreed to plead guilty to the murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison before he could be eligible for parole. As for the other girl, Craig mentioned her name as Mary Stoddard. She was the 18-year-old daughter of a chiropractor who had come to Vegas when he kidnapped and killed her. Ginger Rios's relatives hoped that he would be charged with Mary's murder, which could at least result in a life sentence or possibly even the death penalty. But here's the catch. Mary Stoddard, the daughter of a chiropractor as described by Craig, was alive and well. The body of the unidentified girl had already been reburied, but they had previously created a 3D model of what she might have looked like and obtained a DNA sample. This was all the police had, because as it unexpectedly turned out, the documents with information about her place of burial were lost, and no one knew in which grave she was located. In simpler terms, they had lost the body. Nevertheless, the police didn't give up on trying to identify who she was. In their list of missing persons, there were 300 people. Finally, on June 30th, 2010, after 13 years, they managed to identify the girl. More precisely, she turned out to be a teenage girl, as it was 15-year-old Christina Mary Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona. The girl lived in a group home, but constantly ran away from it because she was treated poorly there. She disappeared on May 3, 1997, while carrying a load of laundry to a self-service laundromat. Her path led her past the spy shop in Phoenix. Despite her difficult childhood, Christina had many people who loved her and were looking for her, including her friend Valerie, who never stopped searching for her. Valerie created various social media profiles in an attempt to draw attention to Christina's disappearance. Valerie would say, "No matter how long it takes, I will never stop thinking about her, and I won't give up. For me, she's not just a case number. I loved her. That's true love, never giving up on finding someone." Valerie couldn't have known that Christina was found just a week after her disappearance, in the desert, on her 16th birthday. As for the mystery of the girl's ring, the letter M on it signifies Martinez. Interestingly, the sister of the real Mary Stoddard mentioned that Craig had dated Mary when they were both younger.
The guy was already behaving strangely back then, and if this is true, he could have become so fixated on Mary that after parting ways with her, he always sought women who resembled her to vent his anger. Considering that Mary is alive, but Craig called Christina Mary, it's possible that this was a fantasy he played out in his head while committing the crime, as many killers, especially serial killers, do. Most likely, Craig didn't plan his crimes but succumbed to impulsive acts, as was the case with the teenage girl from Vegas who survived because another customer scared the killer away. It's also possible that he targeted victims, as we know Ginger had been to the store before her disappearance. Craig never revealed the reasons for his behavior, but investigators believe the murders aimed at violence against women because Ginger's underwear was found around her ankles. In any case, now, thanks to being charged with a second murder, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. It's remarkable that Craig was able to deceive so many people so easily. Mark and George, who were searching for Ginger, his own wife Cheryl, who had no inkling of his hidden nature, and even experienced Vegas police officers who had seen much in their careers. He truly appeared like an ordinary family man, and it makes you wonder where one can feel safe, if not with a store owner standing behind the counter with his wife and baby. On the evening of Friday, April 20th, 2012, the Solis family had a very pleasant time. Rebecca and Sergio's two sons played a baseball game in which their 6-year-old sister, young Isabel, was present. The game lasted until 10 o'clock, after which the family returned home. The next morning, the girl was supposed to play baseball and Rebecca braided her hair so as not to waste time before work. At 11 o'clock, Sergio wished his daughter good night and left. Although Isabel had her own bedroom, she often slept in her brother's room. But on this particular night, she stayed alone. Soon, Becky and the boys went to sleep, and Sergio fell asleep on the couch, watching a baseball game he had recorded earlier. At 5 o'clock, the man woke up and slowly made his way to the bedroom. The house was quiet and peaceful when he went to sleep next to his wife. 2 hours later, Rebecca left for work at the medical center. The woman didn't notice anything strange in the house and didn't hear anything. She didn't go into her daughter's room before leaving for work. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, Sergio went to wake his daughter up to go to the game, but Isabel was not in her bed. He asked his sons if they had seen their sister, but nobody responded. Together with the boys, he searched the house and called for Isabel, but there was no answer. Then, Sergio Jr., who was 14 years old at the time, noticed that the window in his sister's room was wide open and the protective screen was lying on the ground in the yard. The husband called his wife. While Rebecca was racing home and the sons were frantically searching the neighborhood for their younger sister, Sergio called the rescue service. This was the call that later sparked a lot of controversy and criticism towards him. People react differently in a state of stress or panic, but Sergio was surprisingly calm and collected during the call. Besides his calmness, it seemed strange to many that he immediately stated that his daughter had been kidnapped. He even laughed when he mentioned telling his wife to come home. Later, Sergio explained that he was simply trying to remain calm to provide the police with all the information they needed. Interestingly, the neighbor also called 911 on behalf of Sergio Jr. Unlike his father, he was shaking and clearly upset, but he also immediately stated that his sister had been kidnapped and they wouldn't find her. Then the phone was handed over to Rebecca, who had also been in a panic and despair when she arrived home. She was able to give a precise description of the clothing that her daughter was wearing before her disappearance. The arriving officers indeed found a protective screen on the bedroom window of the girl on the ground in the yard. There was a large hole in it, as if someone had used a tool to make it. Soft toys were always lying under the girl's window in the room, and now they were scattered in disorder. Blood was discovered on the floor next to Isabel. Shoe prints were found behind the house, on the alley and on the electrical box under the high fence of the family. Presumably, the perpetrator climbed over it when he abducted the girl. The police organized massive searches, going from door to door,
believing it was a kidnapping case, rejecting the idea that the 6-year-old girl could have run away. The neighbor of the Celis family, Alicia Stardevant, said that she was woken up by a noise around 6:30 a.m. Her bedroom is literally across the fence from the girl's room. The girl said that she heard her dogs and the Celis family dogs barking. Besides them, she heard men's voices, seemingly on her side of the fence, not at the Celis family's home. But it was already getting light outside, and she didn't pay attention to it and fell asleep again. Alicia noted that the men did not lower their voices or whisper, and she didn't think for a second that there was also a small child there. The police set up a checkpoint around the Celis family's house and only allowed local residents through. The search initially focused on a small area around the house because in most cases, children are killed within a radius of 100 meters from the place of abduction. Then they expanded the search radius, included several apartment buildings, and interviewed residents. Officers checked the stadium where Isabel's baseball game was supposed to take place, the local garbage dump. The lakes and ponds were inspected with underwater cameras and sonars. Forensic experts and search dogs searched the Celis family's home, and border guards distributed photos of Isabel because when children go missing in Arizona, there is a high chance they end up on the other side of the border with Mexico. In addition, in 2012, 16 criminals who had committed violent acts against women and children lived near the family's home. All of them were interrogated and excluded at that time. A theory emerged that someone had noticed Isabel playing with her brothers in the evening, followed the family, and abducted the girl from the house at night. Following this lead, officers checked the registration numbers of all the cars in the parking lot. Surveillance video cameras located near the family's home showed an unusually active nightlife. At 2:36 a.m., a private security company's car appeared in the alley near the house, and 2 more cars were shown in the parking lot 10 minutes later. Suddenly, a large number of pedestrians were wandering around the house, some of them interested in garbage cans, and an hour before the 911 call, a car quickly turned the corner near the trash can. But the girl did not appear anywhere in the 10 hours of filming. However, something interesting was discovered during the search of the house by the police. The officers found inscriptions on the door frame of Isabel's wardrobe. The inscriptions were written in a child's handwriting and included such words as bad father, I don't love father, and bad day. Rebecca claimed she had no idea about this, but the police decided to interrogate Isabel's family more thoroughly. One of the sons revealed that when their father drank, he became aggressive, cursed, and hit him twice. Therefore, investigators invited employees of the Child Protection Services concerned about the Celis sons, especially since, as it turned out, Child Protection Services had been called to the family's home more than once. In January 2012, one of the boys was washing dishes and left a glass in the detergent. Sergio drank water from that glass and scolded his son for his mistake. Rebecca insists that they laughed about the incident. But the next day, the boy told his friends about it, and someone's parents contacted the Child Protection Services. Anyway, in May 2012, at their request, Sergio voluntarily left the house, although Rebecca claimed that her husband was an excellent father and when Isabel returned home, all questions would be answered. Although the incident was soon resolved, and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and sons, the family was upset that the investigation did not bring any results. Although the incident was soon resolved and Sergio was able to return home to his wife and children, the family was upset that the police continued to focus on them, especially Sergio, despite never being named a suspect. Later, the man stated, "It feels like the investigation never went beyond this house. That's what's so upsetting." So they hired private detective Jerry Snyder to conduct an unbiased investigation into Isabel's abduction. And his suspicions fell on Rebecca's cousin, Justin Mastromarino. At first, Justin acted as a representative of the family, constantly speaking to journalists and giving interviews. But within 2 weeks of Isabel's disappearance, he sent his car to Florida, hired the best lawyer, and left, refusing to answer reporters or police's questions. Such behavior seemed strange to the private detective. Moreover, Justin had lived in the Solis family's home for a long time and still had a key to the house. There was a version that Justin, who had previously stayed overnight in Isabel's room, could owe money to someone and the criminal came for him. But instead of Justin, he found Isabel in the room and took her for ransom or as leverage. On the other hand, his friend Sebastian Hartsfield is confident that Mastro Marino did the right thing, and if he had the means, he would have left too. The thing is, Justin was tired of the intrusive attention of the media and the public. Sebastian said that they spent the evening of the abduction together with Justin. He reluctantly admits that it was April 20th, National Cannabis Day, so he and Justin smoked and drank all evening. Although there was a 6-hour gap when they were asleep, and he cannot say for sure where Justin was, Sebastian is confident in his friend's innocence. When the police finally questioned Justin, the police chief said that the investigator hired by the family had no evidence, but the police were absolutely sure of Justin's innocence. It is worth noting that Sergio was also suspected of owing money to bad people, and his daughter was kidnapped for ransom. Isabel was at the age when children are more often abducted by relatives. She was kidnapped from the house where only her relatives were present, and Sergio was the last person to see her, kissing her goodnight at 11 o'clock. He did not pass a polygraph test. Moreover, the fact that the dogs barked at night indirectly confirms the involvement of someone from the family. How could a stranger know where the girl's room was, that she wouldn't be sleeping in her brother's bedroom, and that there would be no dogs in her room? Usually, at least one of them slept in her bedroom. How could the kidnapper know exactly how to avoid the surveillance cameras located on the street? Yet, besides suspicion, there was nothing linking Sergio or Justin to the crime. Where was Isabel? Let's go back to the morning of July 23, 2012, when the rescue service received 3 distress calls. A child, a girl, called and said she wanted to report a kidnapping. She mentioned Isabel's name and said he's coming, identified the district where she was located, and then the call disconnected. The officers went to the specified district, but they didn't find anyone. They traced the call to an apartment building where 2 sisters, aged 9 and 11, lived. The sisters had simply decided to play a prank. The calls caused a lot of fuss, but they were quickly released. However, their joke cost the city $4,700 in officers' wages spent on the search in the district specified by the girls. After this incident, the police tried several times to draw attention to the case, for example, by sharing an image of what Isabel might look like several years later. But despite all efforts, there was no progress in the case for years. Who kidnapped Isabel? Was it someone unknown to the family who entered through a window and took her? Did Justin consider kidnapping Isabel because he was in debt and wanted to demand a ransom, but the kidnapping went wrong? Was one of her brothers involved in what happened to her, and are their relatives covering it up? Or does Isabel's biological father know more than he's saying? Unexpectedly, on February 8, 2017, there was a breakthrough in the case. A woman named Melissa contacted the FBI and stated that they should speak to her fiancé, Christopher Clements, about the disappearance of Isabel. Supposedly, he might know something about the girl's disappearance, but Melissa couldn't say anything more and they should talk to him. Finding Christopher proved to be quite easy. He was in jail on charges of robbery. Christopher confirmed to the agents that he knew where to find Isabel, but demanded a deal. In exchange for information about Isabel's whereabouts, he wants his charges dropped, his confiscated Acura Honda returned, and full immunity in Isabel's case. He assured them that he only knows what happened to the girl. It is also known to a member of the Celis family. He hinted that Sergio knew about the kidnapping of his daughter and was involved in it. Christopher told them that Sergio was seen handing over Mexican gold coins to someone at a local pawn shop. Supposedly, there was a fight and Isabel was taken to get the money that her father owed for the stolen coins. Christopher spoke very broadly, and no matter how much the agents questioned him, he didn't go into details. The man stood his ground, information in exchange for a deal. He got what he wanted. The prosecutor's office went for a deal, dropped the charges of robbery and returned the car. The man revealed where to find Isabel, and on March 3, 2017, the police and the FBI found her remains. Rebecca and Sergio Solis faced the grim confirmation that Isabel had left forever. Whatever dreams they had of a happy reunion were destroyed. However, the deal did not give Christopher Clements the desired freedom. Instead, he was transferred to the Maricopa County Jail, where he was charged with another robbery. The agreement did not provide full immunity, which Christopher insisted on in Isabel's case. Investigators began digging deeper into the man's past. He started his criminal career at the age of 16 by committing first-degree violence. Since then, he had repeatedly gotten into trouble. The man's ex-wife said that Christopher was obsessed with adult movies, often brought girls from strip clubs home, and she was forced to sleep in the car until they left. And at the time of Isabel's disappearance, he worked at a shopping center only 2 kilometers away from her home. Undoubtedly, detectives checked Sergio's connection to the nearby pawn shop mentioned by Christopher. They found out that 21 gold coins were stolen from the woman's house 2 months before Isabel's abduction, and they believed that Christopher committed the theft. The surveillance camera captured him entering the pawn shop hours after the theft, delivering the goods, and receiving the money. The video did not suggest Sergio's involvement or any connection to the case. Most likely, Christopher was just studying the accusations against Sergio, which were mentioned in the press, and was talking to agents, trying to cast a shadow on the girl's father. The police received several search warrants, including one for the house where Christopher and his fiancée Melissa used to live. In one corner of the yard, investigators found a sheet of plywood under which was a plastic container containing ashes and several gruesome discoveries, including a faded lilac child's hoodie with a hood and a school assignment of a very young child with the name Mercedes on it. Her full name was Isabel Mercedes Celis. They also found indecent photos of girls aged 3 to 13 on Christopher's devices. Searches on his computer included Isabel Celis, unsolved cases in Arizona, and child killer acquitted. A former acquaintance of Christopher's said he talked about the Isabel case and let slip that there might be evidence in the trunk of his car, so it was crucial to bring it back. The car was described as a Honda Acura that was returned to the man in exchange for information about Isabel's whereabouts. It is still unknown how Isabel died, but according to the same acquaintance, she was suffocated and her body was doused with chemicals. The man remembered that Christopher showed him photos of the Celis house that he had hidden in a Bible in his room. Investigators obtained a warrant for this Bible and indeed found pictures of the house. 2 months later, the Tucson police chief announced that they had a suspect, 36-year-old Christopher Clements, who had been charged with not 1, but 2 murders. The thing is, on March 3, 2017, when Christopher described to agents the location where they would find Isabel, he mentioned an important marker, a pile of tires that clearly did not appear there in just 1 day. This instruction immediately alarmed the agents, because a few years ago, the police found the body of a teenage girl from Tucson near that same tire pile. The girl's name was Maribel Gonzalez. In June 2014, 2 years had passed since Isabel's disappearance, when a rescue service dispatcher answered a horrifying call. A woman reported a body she had noticed by the roadside. The police who arrived on the call found signs that someone had been dragged on the ground, the smell of decay, and a naked body buried under the pile of tires. It was a location significantly distant from the nearest houses. The police shared with the media a photo of a chain with an anchor that the girl was wearing, as well as a tattoo on her collarbone, in hopes that the public would help identify her. Indeed, several people called the police saying that it was 13-year-old Maribel Gonzalez. Maribel's family said that she was seeing a 20-year-old man named Mariano.
They had been together for 3 years but broke up a month before Maribel disappeared. Mariano told the police that she sent him a message around 11 to 12 p.m. on the day of her disappearance, asking him to pick her up because she had a fight with her mother. He ignored her message because he had to get up early for work. He never saw her again. Her boyfriend said that she loved to walk alone, even at night. She also liked to go to the mall, the same one near Isabel's house where Christopher Clements worked. The police linked these cases based on the fact that the bodies were found in close proximity to each other. Christopher's DNA was compared to the DNA found on Maribel, and it matched. Isabel was kidnapped and killed 2 years before Maribel. Could the perpetrator have been caught after the first crime and prevented Maribel's death? It turns out that Christopher's name came up during the investigation before his conversation with the agents in 2018, more than once. As it is already known, the officers contacted all individuals who committed sexual crimes and lived nearby Isabel, violent acts against women and children. The list contained 16 names, including Christopher. He was listed as a Class 3 offender, meaning with a very high likelihood of reoffending. The police talked to him, but obviously he was able to convince the officer that he had nothing to do with the case. Perhaps his girlfriend provided him with an alibi. Furthermore, after Isabel's disappearance, her parents asked to recall any unexpected meetings, uninvited guests, traders, advertising agents, distributors, anyone who could arouse suspicion. Rebecca immediately remembered a man who was interested in their red Acura. He came twice, but the woman did not know his name, and he never entered the house. Interestingly, Christopher also mentioned that meeting during the interrogations. This is what he told FBI agents on February 10, 2017. According to him, 2 people pretended to be interested in the car. In fact, they needed to make sure that Sergio lived at that address. They approached Rebecca, and she gave them the phone number and said that they needed to talk about the possibility of buying from her husband Sergio. Thus, the men confirmed what they wanted. Christopher said that he just knew about this visit, but he himself never approached the Solisev's house. However, during the conversation, he several times referred to we instead of they, as if confessing that one of the men was him. Christopher's description of the visit coincides with Rebecca's story, except for one detail. The woman described only one man who matched Christopher's description and drove the same car as he did. But her description differs slightly from the description given by her husband. What if the police had followed this lead immediately after Isabel's disappearance? Would it have led them to Christopher Clements? Investigators believe that the kidnapping of Isabel was not spontaneous. Christopher had planned his crimes. He repeatedly called the home of the woman from whom he stole gold coins when she was not home. He also called the Celis family home as early as October 2011. The day after the kidnapping, Christopher changed his phone number and washed his car. If cleaning his car usually cost him around $10, $35, this time he paid $110. However, changing his phone number did not help, as phone records linked Christopher to 2 crimes. Footprints found at the scene of Isabel's kidnapping matched sneakers that no one in the Celis family wore, but which Christopher was often seen wearing and even photographed in. Detectives also studied photos on his devices and found a miniature snapshot. It was a selfie of a man on the front seat of a car who looked like Clements, and a little girl lying on the back seat who was extremely similar to Isabel. The photo was shown to Sergio and Rebecca. The woman agreed that the girl resembled Isabel, but she could not say for sure because the image quality was terrible. Christopher claimed the child in the photo was his son. But when the photo was shown to Melissa, his fiancée, she began to shake. She did not recognize the child as her own. The child in the photo did not resemble the 1.5-year-old fair-haired boy. Instead, it was more like a dark-haired girl with her hair braided, which Isabel's mother had done just before the kidnapping. The defense argued that the footprints were initially described as work boots. Christopher did not have his phone with him during those calls, and the blood in Isabel's bedroom probably appeared before the kidnapping. Christopher's lawyers successfully pushed for 2 separate trials, one for the Isabel case and one for the Maribel case, so that the prosecutor could not present evidence for both crimes at once. However, this did not help him much because he had already been found guilty of Maribel Gonzalez's murder. He still has to face trial for the kidnapping of Isabel.
What motive for murder would you consider the most trivial? Betrayal, jealousy, or money? Don't rush to answer. This is a tricky question. After all, a jealous person might turn out to be greedy, and an unfaithful wife may burn with jealousy herself. When in a love triangle, each person has their own motive for murder, it won't be easy for the police to figure it out. And then even a killer who no one would dare to call very smart will manage to lead the investigation for 467 days. Growing up in Amarillo, Texas, Robin knew exactly what she wanted in life, even as a child. She wanted to stay at home and take care of her children while her husband provided for the family. Her parents, both military veterans, had a happy marriage that lasted for 40 years, and she dreamed of having a similar relationship. However, things didn't go as planned because she often chose the wrong partners and avoided the good ones as if they were a danger. But above all, Robin feared being alone. She hated being alone, and she was afraid of being alone. Fortunately, thanks to her sociable nature, she got a job as a waitress in a restaurant where there was no shortage of attention from men. And so one evening in 2003, at the age of 22, Robin met a wonderful young man named Jeremy David Spielbauer. Though everyone simply called him JD, 21-year-old JD was gentle, caring, and exceptionally polite. He served in the Marine Corps and had been deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He also found work as a mechanic in civilian life. Needless to say, Robin fell head over heels in love with him. Just 2 months later, she joyfully announced to her parents that she and JD were expecting a child. Her parents had only just learned that she was dating someone, but they chose not to argue. Robin moved into JD's and his mother's house. After the birth of their daughter, they decided to get married. Soon, their second daughter was born. However, as is often the case, financial difficulties made life increasingly challenging for the growing family, and conflicts became inevitable. Then, to the surprise of their friends and family, the family began attending the local church about 3 times a week. There, they made new acquaintances, including a young mother of 2, Katie. The girls quickly became friends, but Robin's friend Aaron House looked with suspicion upon JD's newfound religious devotion. She believed that their church attendance was a more trivial reason, a desire to see Katie more often. Unfortunately, she was right. Robin stubbornly turned a blind eye to everything until the day her husband moved in with his lover. Approximately 8 years into their marriage, Robin filed for divorce and returned to live with her parents. JD and Katie got married on November 10th, the founding day of the Marine Corps. Now, JD helped Katie raise her 2 children, but it was clear that Robin hadn't forgotten her ex-husband until she became interested in Jared. It was evident that the young man genuinely liked Robin, and her friends, especially Aaron, were very happy for her. Robin at last regained her old self, rejoiced, and smiled happily, just like before. It seemed like a happy family and a cozy nest were on the horizon for the girl. But this glimmer of hope quickly dimmed one night in April 2014 when Robin got into her car and drove away, never to return home. On the morning of April 8, 2014, Robin's mother noticed her daughter was missing. She assumed that she had stayed with one of her friends, as she had done in the past, and felt somewhat irritated because she needed to go to work and didn't know who would take her grandchild to school. At that moment, it didn't even occur to her that something might have happened to her daughter. On the same day, around noon, a local businessman was driving on the highway when he turned onto Helium Road, and 3 girls ran towards him shouting, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man contacted the rescue service after the girls told him that they had seen a black Chevrolet Tahoe with a girl lying near the rear wheel. She wasn't breathing and wasn't moving. The officers who arrived at the scene concluded that the poor girl had been there for several hours and had suffered a blow to the head with a blunt object. She had no identification, wallet, or phone with her. However, the license plate of the vehicle helped identify the victim as Robin Spielbauer. Robin's parents had to break the terrible news to her daughters and her ex-husband. JD couldn't believe what had happened and couldn't hold back his tears. He immediately went to the family to support the children and his former in-laws. At the same time, the investigators were examining the crime scene. One unusual detail they noticed was the damage to the car's glass. The rear right door's glass had chips and bright pink paint marks. What did this suggest? It indicated that someone had struck the car's glass with a heavy and pink object. However, the detectives had no idea what significance this discovery would have in their investigation. Therefore, they began questioning Robin's acquaintances. Her boyfriend Jared stated that after work, he went home, played video games, and went to sleep. JD also claimed that he was at home, had 2 glasses of beer, and fell asleep. He hadn't come anywhere near Helium Road that evening and had no idea where Robin might have gone, why, or with whom. However, his phone told a completely different story. According to his text messages, he and his ex-wife were planning to meet that evening. The man had to admit that his wife had gone to her friend's place with their son. He had arranged to meet Robin at his home to discuss their children and wanted his uncle to be there in case his wife returned early. However, he forgot about the meeting and simply fell asleep on the couch after his uncle left. He woke up shortly before 10 p.m. with a strange, oppressive feeling. JD messaged his wife and his uncle, asking if everything was okay. At 10:18, he also messaged Robin, but she didn't respond. He tried calling her, but it went to voicemail. Just a few minutes after JD called his ex-wife, Katie arrived at the house. JD's uncle, who had returned to calm his agitated nephew, confirmed that she arrived around 10:20. They talked for a bit, as JD was still feeling uneasy. The detectives noticed that JD seemed to be trying to hint at something and directly stated that he was raising many suspicions. In response, the man claimed that he had his own suspicions but didn't specify what they were. The investigators had no doubt that JD was hiding something, and as they delved into his life, they discovered what it could be. JD had been married to Robin, but he had an affair with Katie. He then divorced Robin, married Katie, and started a new affair, this time with Robin. JD claimed they maintained friendly relations for the sake of the children, but Katie suspected there was more between him and his ex-wife. JD and Katie argued nearly every day, and Robin found it amusing. She wanted Katie to take her own medicine. The 2 women fought for a man they both considered a traitor, and what made him worth fighting for remained a mystery. Robin's friend Aaron even recalled an incident in 2013 when Robin came to Katie's house to pick up the girls. Katie grabbed and pushed her down the stairs, climbed on top, and started beating her. Robin managed to push her off. When Aaron heard about this, she warned her friend not to be alone with Katie because she was one of those crazies who could kill her. 5 months after that fight, Robin was dead. The investigators, of course, spoke with Katie. She admitted not liking Robin, but claimed she never threatened her. However, she stumbled on the same issue her husband did, her own text messages, and not just 1 or 2 messages. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie sent her husband 336 angry messages. It was clear that she was furious and struggling to find a way to vent her anger. Less than an hour before the murder, she sent the following message to her husband. "My dreams of a happy family have evaporated. I won't force you to continue bearing this burden. You started it, whether you want to believe it or not. I will end it." Statements like these, in the eyes of the investigators, turned the jealous wife into a murder suspect. However, Katie had not only a motive, but also an alibi. She and her son spent the evening at her friend Savannah Guinness's house. They left around 10 p.m. and returned home at 10:20, which was confirmed by JD and his uncle. Furthermore, there was no evidence connecting her to the crime scene, at least not at that point. On the same day that investigators were interrogating Katie, the forensic expert conducted an autopsy on Robin. At the crime scene, it appeared that she had died from a severe blow to the head with a blunt object, but the autopsy revealed something more. A .22 caliber bullet had been fired into the back of the victim's head. Now the police began searching for the weapon. Robin's parents, who lived just a few houses away from Katie and JD, watched as the police conducted a search in their former son-in-law's home. The family had an entire arsenal in the house, which was quite common for Texas. However, one small detail caught a lot of attention. A pistol with a bright pink frame, the same caliber as the bullet that killed Robin. A piece of plastic had broken off the pistol. Therefore, the investigators returned to the crime scene and combed the area around where they found the car. They discovered a .22 caliber shell casing and 2 bright pink plastic fragments that obviously matched the pistol. What was particularly intriguing was that before they found the weapon, but after the murder, the investigators had browsed Katie's Facebook page and found a photo of her shooting the very same pink pistol. However, Before they could realize the significance of this discovery, she deleted the photo. It seemed like Katie didn't want the police to know about the weapon. But why? Detectives took a closer look at where she was at the time of the murder. You may remember she had an alibi. She and her son spent the evening with Savannah's family and left at 10 p.m. However, Savannah told them that Katie and her son had left at 9:50 or around that time. Just 10 minutes, but they were crucial. It only takes from 3 to 5 minutes to drive from Savannah's house to Helium Road. These 10 minutes cast doubt on Katie's alibi, and her best friend was the one who brought it to light. There was more. At 10:13, Katie's phone pinged at a tower that could be considered close to both Savannah's house and the crime scene. This meant that Katie had the means, opportunity, and motive to commit the murder. The police believed they had everything they needed for an arrest. They arrested Katie in front of her 12-year-old son, Diego. By the way, as all witnesses confirmed, Katie was with her son the entire evening. Wouldn't he have noticed if his mother had stopped the car in the middle of a field, had an argument with someone, and then committed a murder? Especially since Robin had not only been shot, but also struck with a blunt object on the head. The teenager surely would have noticed. But when he was questioned, he said that all he remembered was sitting in the car with his mom and playing games on his phone while they drove around the city. Thus, on April 11, 2014, just 4 days after the murder, the investigators informed Robin's parents about the arrest. Robin's loved ones lost a daughter and a friend. But the consolation for them was that the person responsible for her death, Katie Spielbauer, was behind bars. Is the case closed? Not quite. Katie remained in jail, unable to post bail, while investigators and District Attorney James Farron built their case against her. They soon received assistance from an unexpected source. JD came to the police station and stated something he had maintained all along. He had been at home with his uncle when he received a message from Robin proposing a meetup on Helium Road. This time, JD added to his story by saying that just after 9 p.m., Katie returned home. She was in a bad mood and started an argument. JD, not wanting to fight, went to his bedroom and lay down. When he woke up, he found that his wife had left in his car. That was when a terrible feeling of dread overcame him, and he decided to check if everything was all right. JD and his uncle received responses from Katie, confirming everything was fine, but there was no response from Robin. When the detectives asked JD why he decided to tell them about this now, he explained that the thought of his wife being involved in Robin's murder was driving him insane. The investigators challenged JD's story, which contradicted phone records available to the police. JD's phone pinged at 9:23 while he was on his way to the crime scene. JD then explained that someone else had taken his phone and his car. It was Katie. She saw his messages with his lover and took his phone, his car, and went to confront Robin. But why did Katie hit the car's rear right window with a gun? The detectives were convinced that it was likely the lovers had met on Helium Road, sitting in the back seat of the car when Katie arrived. She fired her gun before JD could react, and now he was torn between his loyalty to Katie and his desire for justice for Robin. After a few more days, JD finally agreed to tell everything. JD and Robin had met on Helium Road, sitting in the car and just talking about the kids. When they noticed headlights approaching, they heard a loud knock on the window, obviously not made by a fist. JD opened the door, and it was Katie. The girls immediately started arguing. JD demanded they stop fighting and reassured Katie that they were just talking about the children. He then went to his car and drove home, convinced that Katie would follow him, but he was wrong, so he sent 2 text messages, asking if everything was okay. JD explained that he hadn't told anyone earlier because he didn't want to believe it, as he still loved Katie, but now it was all over. He filed for divorce and never visited his wife in jail, as she was going to be there for a long time unless she could prove her innocence. When investigators took on the case, it seemed simple and straightforward. It took them 4 days to link Katie to the murder. The prosecutor believed that after some time in jail, Katie would confess. However, even her husband's admission didn't help. Katie demanded a polygraph test. The police provided her with that opportunity and she took another one. She failed it miserably, but it didn't break her. She still refused to confess. Katie didn't deny her animosity towards her rival, but claimed she would never kill her or arrange someone else to commit murder. The reason lay in her tragic upbringing. Her father died when she was 2, and she buried her mother at 18. Knowing the hardships of growing up without parents, she would never do such a thing to Robin's children. All the evidence against Katie was circumstantial, and they needed something more solid. That's when a breakthrough happened. In the prosecutor's office, someone mentioned a case where smartphones could leave digital footprints when connecting to Wi-Fi networks. Katie's phone had its Wi-Fi turned off, but her son Diego's phone had it on. This meant that investigators could track Diego's every move and consequently that of his mother that night. Since all the witnesses consistently stated that the teenager was always with his mother, tracing Diego's phone could lead them to Katie. The prosecutor instructed his assistants to obtain this information, and it took months to do so. When the data was finally acquired, the prosecutor met with Katie. By that time, she had spent 467 days in jail awaiting trial. The prosecutor told Katie that he considered this information the final piece needed. He was confident that it would send her to prison for life, but it turned out to be the key to her freedom, allowing her to reunite with her children. She couldn't believe it, breaking down in tears due to the overwhelming emotions. She admitted that during her time in jail, she had harbored the darkest thoughts, fearing that if she were found guilty, she would have to be carried out in a body bag. She would prefer her children to believe their mother had passed away rather than having her incarcerated for murder. Suddenly, with the snap of fingers, she was free. Within hours, the case against her was closed, and she was released. A happy ending? Not quite, as if Katie was innocent. It meant that someone else got away with murder. The prosecutor publicly admitted his mistake. He realized that JD had outsmarted him simply because everyone underestimated him, believing he wasn't clever enough to orchestrate a murder. Although there was a small arsenal in his home, he chose the pink gun, which often jammed after the first shot, solely because it belonged to Katie. He could have disposed of it in the desert where it might never be found, but he brought it back home. Moreover, surveillance cameras captured a car similar to his near the crime scene at approximately the time of the murder. Although the face and license plate weren't visible, investigators were convinced it was JD behind the wheel, and no car remotely resembling Katie's was seen there. But the most significant lie he told was not about the night of the murder, but his past. JD had never served in the Marine Corps or any other military branch, nor had he been to Iraq or Afghanistan. All those stories were fabrications to impress women like Katie, whose parents had military ties, something that spoke volumes about his character. The prosecutor was certain that at some point before Robin's murder, she had told JD that she had met someone else and they would no longer be lovers. Additionally, she had expressed her desire to finally receive full child support payments. JD's scheme was simple: kill Robin to get rid of her, frame Katie to eliminate her as well, and then remain financially stable while finding a younger and more agreeable girlfriend. This would solve all his problems. However, the prosecutor hesitated to press charges, and 9 months later, Robin's mother called him. It turned out JD had asked her to do him a favor and buy him a ticket to New York, claiming he needed to go there for the weekend. Presumably, he planned to flee since it was just a short distance from New York to the Canadian border. This prompted the prosecutor to take action, but an arrest doesn't equal a conviction. That's why he took another unexpected step by inviting Katie as a witness in the case. The prosecutor was confident that his earlier mistake would now help convict JD. Robin was killed with a pink gun, and either JD or Katie had to be the murderer. It was certainly not Katie. The defense argued that if Robin had been severely beaten and then shot, it pointed towards Katie as the perpetrator because both actions could have killed her, suggesting the murderer was in a state of rage. Moreover, JD couldn't have framed Katie easily because he wasn't smart enough for such a plan. If he wanted to frame his wife, he would have ensured that she had no alibi. JD could have been sentenced to death if the jury believed that the crime included a robbery because Robin's phone and wallet went missing, and later, her daughter's documents were found in JD's car. However, the jury decided that this was more likely a theft than a robbery. Therefore, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after April 20th, 2046, when he would be 63 years old. Justice was served for Robin,
but her parents still felt the pain of the thought that their daughter's greatest fear came true when JD left her alone on that remote road. In January 2020, the case took an unexpected turn. The appellate court overturned JD's conviction. It turned out that 2 jurors had formed opinions about the defendant and the case before the trial, which was not allowed by the procedure.
Additionally, JD had complained about the performance of his lawyers. In 2021, the court found no issues with the jury selection process. However, the case was once again sent back to the appellate court to assess JD's complaint about his attorneys. It's important to note that the appellate court did not conclude that the man was innocent, but rather that there was a procedural error. Even if JD's trial is conducted again, Katie, who currently works at a law firm, has promised to be present on behalf of Robin to ensure that justice prevails once more. Katie herself has become the director of a company that helps teenagers and adults overcome emotional and physical traumas and change their lives for the better through sports. Kauai is the Hawaiian island garden, rightfully bearing the title of one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Tourists come here to enjoy an unforgettable vacation, with jagged coastal cliffs, lush tropical forests, and no one notices the not-so-young man alone, handing out leaflets and telling the story of his brutally murdered daughter Sandra. When Sandra Gallus was found strangled, the police quickly narrowed down the suspects to 2. The case seemed crystal clear and straightforward, but it took many years before justice prevailed, all thanks to one determined father. Standing at his daughter's grave, he vowed that as long as he lived, she would not be forgotten, and her case would be solved. This is the story of a father who remained the driving force behind the investigation, setting himself the goal of securing the conviction of his daughter's killer and allowing nothing to stand in his way. Sandra, the daughter of Toshi and Larry Mendonca, was born in Japan, her mother's homeland. However, the family later decided to move to the island of Kauai, closer to Larry's parents, as they were getting older and needed assistance. The family lived on a ranch, and Sandra and her older brother Lawrence Jr. adored the place. Few children could boast of having a waterfall right by their home. They spent a lot of time walking on the beach, swimming, and when they got hungry, they were surrounded by 2 fruit orchards where mangoes and citrus fruits grew. Sandra was very determined, responsible, and achieved her goals. From the age of 5, Sandra practiced gymnastics, performed in a cheerleading group at school, continued to participate in sports, and attended numerous clubs and groups, all while being raised in an environment that valued both Japanese and Portuguese traditions. The family's father, Larry, was a veteran of the Air Force, raising his children with discipline. In fact, he sought to instill independence and self-reliance in his daughter and son, insisting that Sandra pursue her higher education in Honolulu. The city seemed enormous to the girl from the small island, but she missed her native island of Kauai and her family, and visited as often as she could. It was during one of these visits that she met Darren. During the summer break of 1999, Sandra found temporary work at a transportation company where she met her future husband, Darren Gallus. She was 21, he was closer to 30, and he immediately captivated the young, inexperienced girl. She fell head over heels for him, dropped out of university, and soon the young couple got married. 9 months later, their first child, Austin, was born, followed by Braden 2 years later. Sandra adored her boys, and the family life seemed happy until April 2005, when she went to her parents, visibly distraught. She told them that while she was taking things out of her husband's backpack, 2 slips of paper fell out, each with a different phone number. Sandra called these numbers and found out they belonged to 2 different married women. She demanded an explanation from her husband. He didn't admit to anything, insisting that he only had friendly relationships with the women. But Sandra knew it was a lie and realized she couldn't forgive her husband. By June, Darren had moved out of the family home, leaving Sandra to deal with the bills on her own. She began searching for work and landed a job as an assistant manager at a highly popular restaurant, considered one of the island's landmarks. Sandra seamlessly integrated into the restaurant staff, earning the appreciation of her colleagues, who joyfully watched as the quiet girl from the small island transformed into a confident, independent woman. She changed her image, spending more time with friends and relishing her newfound freedom. Moreover, she started receiving attention from one of the restaurant's chefs named Ryan Shinjo, who had recently moved to Kauai from Oahu. Sandra found these attentions very pleasing. Sandra's relationship with Ryan was nothing like her relationship with her ex-husband. The couple spent a lot of time together, going out, relaxing, attending concerts, and even traveling to Honolulu for shopping trips, where Ryan spoiled Sandra with expensive gifts, such as Louis Vuitton suitcases. It seemed that Sandra was very happy with her new boyfriend, and a new beautiful chapter of her life had begun. This continued until January 25, 2006, when Sandra's boss called her parents asking if they knew where their daughter was because she hadn't shown up for work.
It was unusual for Sandra to miss work and not answer calls, but her parents, who were visiting her older brother in Dallas at the time, weren't worried, thinking she might have some urgent matters to attend to. However, at 3 o'clock in the morning, another call came in, a time when bad news usually arrives. Sandra's brother answered the call. Their father understood everything when he heard his son's prolonged scream, "No!" He would never forget that cry, dividing his life into before and after the murder of his daughter. Sandra was found by her boyfriend Ryan. Since no one could reach her at 9:30 p.m., he went to check if she was home. The door was locked and no one answered. However, he went around the house, looked through the ventilation gap below the garage, and thought he saw a girl in the car. He couldn't open the garage himself, so he called a friend who quickly arrived with tools. Sandra was indeed lying in the car. She was slumped to the right on the passenger seat, face down. Her body had long gone cold. Sandra's shirt and bra were twisted. Bruises adorned her face. Her lip was split, and there were clear marks on her neck from strangulation. She had been choked with something thin, resembling fishing line. However, the arriving police officers couldn't find anything resembling a murder weapon. The girl was killed early in the morning, 10 hours before Ryan arrived. But it was impossible to determine the exact time of death. All of Sandra's belongings, including her phone, remained in place. Nothing was missing from her purse, car, or home. There were also no signs of violence. In other words, it was obvious that whoever killed Sandra did so in a fit of rage. Fingerprints of Darren and Ryan were found, but since one of them had lived in the house until recently and the other had been in a relationship with her, it didn't raise suspicions. However, the fact that Ryan found the body raised questions. Why didn't he call 911 immediately and instead first asked a friend to come over? This wouldn't be the first time a killer tries to establish an alibi by enlisting a friend's support. During questioning, Ryan behaved strangely, clearly nervous, and officers felt he was withholding something. However, he had an alibi. He was at work, confirmed by his colleagues. Darren, on the other hand, was more intriguing. That morning, he called in sick to work, essentially lacking an alibi. Darren showed no reaction to Sandra's death but told investigators that he still loved his wife and wanted to reconcile. His colleagues revealed that 2 days before the murder, Darren, working on the road, saw Sandra and Ryan together as they drove past in her car. Witnesses said Darren exploded with rage. He was furious, tearing and throwing things. In other words, he had a motive and lacked an alibi for the time of the murder. He was detained, but the next day, lacking additional evidence, he was released. Days, weeks, and months passed without any progress in the case. Crushed by loss and yearning for answers, Sandra's father, Larry Mendonca, began his own investigation. A local resident and former military man, he had the connections and skills to piece together all the facts surrounding his daughter's murder. At that time, and this is crucial for the case, Sandra and Darren were disputing custody of their 2 sons. But Sandra worked evenings at the restaurant, and the boys stayed overnight with Darren. Sandra would pick them up at 6 in the morning, feed them breakfast, and get them ready for school and daycare. However, Larry learned that on the evening before her murder, Sandra stayed overnight at her boyfriend's house. He drove her home around 6 in the morning. Then, according to neighbors, she went to pick up the boys and quickly returned, but without the children. Larry also discovered that at 10 o'clock, his daughter had an appointment for a manicure at a salon 45 minutes away from her home. She never showed up. This helped narrow down the time frame when she was killed, from 6:30 to 9:15 in the morning, when she needed to leave to make it to the salon. Since Ryan had an alibi and Darren didn't, Larry's thoughts moved in the same direction as the investigators. Darren must have been the one to kill Sandra. There was no one else. Sandra's friend confirmed that many of her friends were convinced Darren would be arrested and convicted. The children would be placed under the custody of their grandparents or Sandra's brother, and everything would be resolved. But the police were in no hurry to press charges. Then, a year after the murder, news of an arrest spread. But it wasn't Darren. The island of Kauai is unique in many aspects, particularly in its lack of mass media. In most cases, news spreads the same way it did generations ago, through word of mouth, where facts, rumors, and speculations intertwine into a single narrative. Thus, across the island, new information began to circulate. FBI agents had arrested Ryan Shinjo. However, it wasn't in connection with the murder, but rather with illicit substances. Ryan turned out to be a member of a major organization smuggling these substances to the island from Honolulu. It involved significant amounts of money and serious shipments,
and FBI agents had been monitoring Ryan for months. Rumors and speculations began to spread across the island. Could Ryan have used his girlfriend as an unsuspecting carrier of the goods? After all, he bought her Louis Vuitton suitcases. Did she unknowingly bring something back from their trip that she wasn't aware of? What if she discovered the truth and she was killed to prevent her from going to the police? Rumors abounded, but the police didn't come any closer to catching the girl's killer, whoever they might be. The case faded away with each passing year. Meanwhile, Larry and Toshi faced the painful reality of not only losing their daughter but also their grandchildren. When their mother was killed, they were only 3 and 5 years old. Darren no longer needed to fight for custody, and he raised the children on his own. Initially, the grandchildren would visit their grandparents on weekends, but within 3 months, they started protesting against these trips. Larry persisted in trying to maintain a relationship with his grandchildren, but it was evident that Darren was turning the children against their late mother's parents. Darren himself appeared everywhere with his new girlfriend Sharon, whom he knew even before Sandra's murder. Then, in 2009, 3 years after his daughter's murder, Larry began to conceive a dark plan for revenge for her death. Fortunately, his plans were put on hold when a new police chief arrived on the island of Kauai, bringing renewed hope for justice to Larry. Police Chief Darryl Perry had been enjoying retirement, but returned to work after the sudden loss of his 26-year-old son. Therefore, he understood the pain of a father who lost a child. After a very emotional meeting with Larry, Chief Perry resolved that Sandra Gallus's case must be solved at all costs. The new police chief enlisted the help of 2 friends in Honolulu, investigators from the cold case department, to review Sandra's case. Perhaps they could notice something that had been overlooked, and indeed, they managed to discover something using advancements that were cutting edge for 2009. Two forensic scientists had the capability to extract DNA from an item touched only once. With this technology, they found Darren's DNA on the victim's shirt and bra. Larry hoped that they were getting closer to solving the case, and the police thought an arrest was imminent. However, the prosecutor deemed it insufficient evidence because Darren never denied seeing his wife every day. The investigation stalled once again. Years continued to pass one after another. In 2012, the police chief assigned the case to a new detective, Bryson Ponce, who thoroughly reviewed all the evidence. The investigation led Bryson Ponce back to the same 2 initial suspects. But which one was the murderer? What evidence pointed against Ryan? Aside from his involvement in smuggling illicit substances, there was something suspicious about how he found the girl's body. He couldn't enter the garage through the closed door and had to call a friend who helped him open it. Perhaps he was seeking to secure a witness. Moreover, he clearly had something to hide and failed a polygraph test. But didn't he have an alibi? Here was another twist. As the new investigator discovered, the time of Sandra's death was more of an estimation. She could have been killed hours earlier when Ryan wasn't at work. However, Darren's position wasn't much more reliable, primarily because he provided completely different statements regarding the events of that morning. Initially, he claimed that Sandra had stopped by to pick up the boys. Then he corrected himself, saying she didn't stop by. He also failed the polygraph test. But here's what's interesting. The couple were battling for custody, and Darren had the idea to keep a diary where he recorded all of his wife's shortcomings, such as when she failed to pick up the children on time. He hoped this would help him gain full custody. Reviewing the diary, investigator Bryson Ponce noticed that entries were made every day from January 1st until the 24th. But on the 25th, the day of the murder, it was blank. If Sandra hadn't shown up at all to pick up the children, Darren would have definitely noted it, given how detailed his previous entries were. Such a gift from her side he wouldn't have missed. After all, he couldn't have known about her death until late in the evening at the earliest. Interestingly, he didn't even call his wife to clarify when she would arrive, perhaps because he knew very well that she would never arrive again. The investigator found something else. Just 3 weeks before Sandra's death, she sent emails to her lawyer describing her husband as a cruel, dangerous man who viewed her as his property and was jealous of Ryan. She detailed how her husband grabbed her, shook her violently, and yelled at her never to call her boyfriend again. He also used the children to his advantage. When Sandra came to pick up the boys at 6 in the morning, he would refuse to open the door for a long time, shouting that he didn't want to wake up so early and demanding that she leave his house because she was allegedly intruding on his property, although he knew perfectly well that the children needed to be fed and taken to school and daycare. After conducting a thorough investigation, Bryson Ponce concluded that on that morning Sandra did indeed come for the children, but she and Darren had a quarrel, and she was forced to leave without them. Darren, still enraged after the argument, followed her, parked his car on the street a little further from Sandra's house to avoid being noticed by neighbors, and when his wife got out of the car, he attacked her. Then, he simply went back home to the children. The investigator submitted the final report to the police chief and the prosecutor. The district attorney finally agreed to bring the case to trial because everyone believed that no one else but Ponce could do more for the case, and they would not find any new evidence. Darren was charged with his wife's murder. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bail. Sandra's relatives thought that the trial was imminent, but they were mistaken. Unexpected circumstances intervened. The district attorney, who agreed to bring Darren's case to trial, lost during re-election to her post, and her successor criticized her work. He stated that she tried to use the high-profile murder case for her own purposes, hoping it would increase her chances of re-election. The new district attorney was convinced that they would not win the case in court because there were two suspects, and the defense would never let this fact rest. And in this case, the second suspect was a convicted felon serving time in federal prison. The court date kept getting postponed, and Larry Mendonca was not getting any younger. He feared that the promise of achieving justice, which he made at his daughter's grave, might not come to fruition, and these thoughts wore him down. Early in the morning on February 14, 2017, the 75-year-old Larry felt unwell. He was taken to the hospital with a heart attack. It was difficult for his son and wife to see him lying in the hospital bed. His condition was quite serious, but he managed to pull through. For months, he underwent physical therapy to be ready for the trial in the summer of 2017, but it was postponed once again. Meanwhile, Darren, his former son-in-law, continued to live his life, attending his children's football games with his new wife, Sharon. In 2017, Ryan Shindo, who had served 10 years in federal prison, was released and decided to speak with the prosecutor. He revealed that he and Sandra had been afraid of Darren because of his aggressive behavior, constantly provoking Ryan to fights. After one altercation at a restaurant, Sandra shouted at her husband, "Don't you dare hit me, Darren." She confessed that he had already allowed himself to hit her. Despite his criminal record, Ryan was not inherently aggressive, unlike Darren, and fully cooperated with the investigation. Finally, at the end of 2017, the district attorney decided that his investigators had completely ruled out Ryan as a suspect, and Darren could be tried for second-degree murder. Suddenly, Darren's lawyer shocked everyone by stating that his client was willing to make a deal with the prosecution, but on his own terms. He agreed not to contest the charge of first-degree assault. In other words, he did not admit guilt in the murder or the assault. However, he agreed to accept punishment for the first-degree assault, for causing serious injuries to Sandra. It sounded like mockery of justice, but the prosecutor still wasn't sure if he could prove the man's guilt in the murder and agreed to the deal. Larry Mendonca was disappointed and angry. In 2017, Darren could have been sentenced to either 10 years in prison or probation. This meant that despite brutally strangling his wife, he might not spend a single day behind bars. Everything was supposed to be decided on May 30th, 2018. Larry awaited the start of the trial with a large support group, family members, friends who knew Sandra, and people advocating for justice. 12 years of investigation condensed into an hour of trial. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Would the judge send the defendant home or to prison? As expected, the defense attorney reminded the judge of the alternative suspect. He also reiterated that this was not a murder case, and his client did not admit guilt in anything, only agreeing to punishment for assaulting his wife. Larry also spoke in court. He was given the opportunity to unleash 12 years of pain and despair, starting from that dreadful night when he informed his daughter's mother of her death. How do you tell a woman that the little girl who once fell asleep in her arms, played on her knees, ran to school clutching the lunch she made for her, is gone? Looking at Darren, Larry declared, his family received a life sentence, full of pain, sorrow, and disappointment. A lifelong imprisonment, forever. Darren didn't react to this statement as if it had nothing to do with him. It was time for the judge's decision. Larry was on pins and needles. The judge reiterated the defense attorney's words about the deal and what the defendant agreed to. The attorney whispered to Larry that it didn't promise anything worthwhile. But no, the judge sentenced Darren to the maximum possible term of imprisonment, 10 years. Darren appealed, and his sentence was reduced. But the 12-year struggle for justice for the Mendonca family had come to an end.
Larry, Toshi, and their son Lawrence established a foundation and hold annual golf tournaments to raise funds to help victims of domestic violence and to ensure that the public does not forget Sandra's death. Unfortunately, Larry and Toshi failed to reconcile with their grandchildren, who are convinced of their father's innocence and hate their grandparents and even their late mother. By seeking justice for their daughter, Larry and
Toshi foresaw this but couldn't act differently. All they have left today are a few rituals on the anniversary of Sandra's death. They bring flowers to her memorial, dine at the restaurant where she worked, and visit the grave where Sandra rests among her ancestors. Sandra, who longed for her native island while away from it, is now forever a part of it.
Megan Carr and Cherish DeSantis seemed destined to become best friends. The girls were born just a day apart, attended the same school, clubs, and activities together, and their parents thought each of them had 2 daughters. Both of their families were quite wealthy. Megan's father owned and managed a company specializing in drilling water wells. It had been a family business since the 1940s, bringing in around $2 million annually. However, by 1992, Megan's parents had divorced, and she lived with her mom, Shirley. As for Cherish's father, he was a well-known tobacco auctioneer in town and nationwide for over 30 years. While such auctions are not as common now, back then, it was a thriving business. In the spring of 1992, 16-year-old Megan and Cherish were
popular students at Thomasville High School in Georgia. Their families made sure their daughters behaved appropriately, although there was never a need for concern. The girls never caused trouble, excelled in their studies, and all their activities were within the bounds of propriety. Even during vacations, they looked forward to peaceful beach getaways rather than raucous parties. Thursday, March 26, 1992, marked the last day before spring break. After that, students could forget about school until April 6th. Megan and Cherish were eager to squeeze in some beach time. Not in Thomasville, of course, but in Florida, less than 60 kilometers away. For Thomasville students, crossing the border to visit the beaches of Tallahassee was a common practice. It took about 2 hours and the trip was quite enjoyable. The young women preferred a single beach that wasn't overrun by tourists. It was called Bold Point, a picturesque 13-kilometer shoreline, popular for birdwatching, wildlife, and yes, alligators, hence its name. Overall, it was a wonderful spot to relax under the sun and take a swim. That was Megan and Cherish's plan. Therefore, at 10 o'clock on Friday morning, the girls packed their swimsuits, towels, and, hopping into Megan's new Honda, headed for Florida, planning to spend the entire day at the beach. They intended to return home that same evening. Some of their friends were supposed to join them, but at the last moment, some had second thoughts or urgent matters came up. The girls arrived at Alligator Point Beach around noon. Megan parked the car, they grabbed their towels, changed into their bikinis, and turned on the rock station on the boombox. After wandering leisurely along the beach for a few hours, a married couple noticed the girls and, seeing that they were resting in a somewhat unusual pose, one girl lying on top of the other, decided not to disturb them. The couple veered wide around them to avoid causing any disturbance. However, on their way back, they realized that the girls hadn't moved at all. Even as they openly stared at them for minutes, the girls remained still. The man asked his wife to stay put while he approached them closer. He saw blood and shouted to his wife that the girls appeared to be dead and they needed to call the police. Alligator Point Beach was a family-friendly beach where visitors enjoyed walks and picnics. The police were aware that there had never been attacks on women at this beach. Therefore, the arriving officers were also horrified by what had happened. The ongoing contrast of the radio continuing to play rock music added to the chilling atmosphere of the murder scene juxtaposed against the carefree beach setting. The officers found the girls' identification and conducted a preliminary identification. They were 16-year-old Megan and Cherish. In addition to their documents, all their belongings were nearby: wallets, cash, Megan's car keys, beach bags, and towels. The girls were in bikinis, so the police ruled out robbery or violence against them as motives. Megan had a towel draped over her head soaked in her blood. Cherish lay on Megan with a head wound as well. As later determined by the medical examiner, each girl had been shot twice in the head from close range with a .38 caliber firearm. There was a lot of blood around the bodies. Besides the bullet holes, there were no other injuries on the victims, as if they had been caught off guard and didn't fight for their lives. Therefore, reluctantly,
The police had to consider whether this was someone the girls knew. It seemed unlikely that a stranger could have approached so closely without the victims screaming or attempting to escape. And who could have known they would be relaxing in this isolated part of the beach? It appeared that the attack was planned, and someone had been monitoring them and traveled all the way from home. But who would want to kill two schoolgirls? The police began interviewing possible witnesses among local residents and regular beachgoers because although it was a remote part of the beach, families were nearby and cars were parked in the lot. They should have heard gunshots or the victims' cries. One regular beachgoer indeed heard sounds around 12:30 that he mistook for fireworks. Now, of course, it was evident he had heard 4 gunshots. Shortly afterward, a car passed by him that he hadn't seen there before. It was a long blue car resembling a Chevrolet Nova or something similar. Officers also went to the parking lot where Megan's car was parked and noticed something strange. There were plenty of open parking spots, but someone had blocked Megan's car in such a way that she couldn't leave. It wasn't a Chevrolet, but the car turned out to be blue. Approaching, the officers saw a man inside with a camera on his lap. When asked what he was doing there, the man explained that he had been photographing birds in the area all day. He had seen people, of course, but not teenage girls dancing on the beach. He rather aggressively stated that he had no interest in watching girls dance on the beach. Curiously, who mentioned anything about dancing on the beach? The man was taken in for questioning and a weapon was found in his trunk. The police were already rubbing their hands, thinking they had quickly solved the case. During questioning, the man admitted he had seen the girls but denied any involvement in the murders, claiming they were alive when he passed by them on the beach. He even underwent a polygraph test. The gun found in his trunk turned out to be a completely different caliber than the murder weapon, so the suspect was released. The bartender from the establishment near the beach where the girls died recalled a strange incident that occurred on the day of the murders involving an unusual visitor. He entered as soon as the establishment opened, ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail, but the bartender wasn't quite ready for service due to a delay, so she told the man the drink would be on the house. However, he insisted on paying. This alone wouldn't have been odd, except for his words. "You'd better take this money because it's the first and last time I'll come in here." Whether he meant to offend her or not, he stayed in the bar for 40 minutes and left shortly before the presumed time of Megan and Cherish's murders. Meanwhile, it was getting dark, approaching dinner time, when Megan and Cherish were expected home, but they hadn't returned. Megan's mother called Cherish's parents to see if her daughter was with them, but they hadn't seen her either. The woman was a bit worried, but she knew the girls were responsible and assumed they were just running a bit late. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The Florida police notified their colleagues in Thomasville about what had happened and asked them to inform the families of the victims. How can anyone prepare someone for the news that their loved one will never come home again? It was a tragedy for both families. They felt as though they had lost 2 daughters. Although the officers tried to be as tactful as possible, they needed to ask several questions. The girls' relatives explained that they spent almost all their time together, either at Megan's house or Cherish's. The only other person they spent a lot of time with was Alex, Cherish's boyfriend. The families insisted that Alex had nothing to do with the murders, but everyone was considered a suspect until ruled out by the police. Moreover, they were troubled by how the killer got so close to the girls. This meant they didn't see him as a threat. Therefore, suspicion fell on Alex next. But he seemed genuinely grieving, just like everyone else, unable to believe they were gone. The police were convinced that Alex must have known where the girls would be hanging out. He replied that he could have found out if he wanted to, but they never discussed it. Additionally, when Megan and Cherish went to the beach, he was at work in the factory. His colleagues indeed confirmed the young man's alibi, so the police left Alex alone and allowed him to mourn the loss of his girlfriend and her friend. The police had no solid leads and disclosed almost nothing to the public. Therefore, all sorts of wild rumors circulated about the motive for the murders. Some speculated that the girls were random victims of drug smuggling, with smugglers landing on the beach and killing unwanted witnesses. However, there was no evidence of any boat landing on the beach. Others recalled that the beach used to be a nudist beach and suggested the girls might have been targeted for occasionally sunbathing topless there. But Megan and Cherish were in bikinis, so this theory didn't make sense. The most plausible theory was that someone was upset about Cherish's father's tobacco business, perhaps due to a failed deal, and took out their anger on his daughter. However, the police couldn't find any evidence to support this theory. Time passed, and the police couldn't make progress. There was neither a motive nor evidence to find the culprit. Even experienced police officers didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, societal pressure was mounting.
The only lead that demanded substantial police resources was the blue Chevrolet Nova. Police spoke with all owners of similar blue cars in the state of Florida. In Georgia, they couldn't do this because in 1992, the state lacked a database of car colors. Officers went door to door, interviewing car owners. Several times they felt they were onto something, such as when they discovered that an owner of a similar model lived across the street from one of the girls, or when they found a former convict acting suspiciously at the crime scene. But all these promising leads didn't amount to anything. Suddenly, a woman called the sheriff's office in Tallahassee. She claimed to know who shot the girls because she was on the beach when it happened. This call was a godsend for the police, giving them renewed hope that the case would be solved. She said the man's name was Sam Haynes, and he lived near the beach. However, when asked to identify herself, she hung up. She had called from a payphone, so tracing her location was impossible. Although the police desperately wanted to find her, as she confessed to being involved in the crime, they couldn't locate her. It turned out that despite Sam living near the beach, he was actually working at a construction site in Atlanta, Georgia, 6 hours away from the crime scene. Investigators suspected Sam might have followed the girls when they drove that day. Upon learning he was being sought, Sam contacted the police himself. He claimed he was at work in Atlanta on March 27th and insisted someone was lying about him. Sam suspected it was Linda, his ex-wife's sister. As it turned out, Sam was not mistaken. Linda accused her former brother-in-law of the high-profile murder of the two girls as revenge for mistreatment of her sister. It's remarkable she took this step, considering she could have been arrested herself. In any case, detectives spent a lot of time in vain. If it weren't for the next crucial event, they wouldn't have solved the case no matter how hard they worked. On Friday, May 15th at 10 a.m., the sheriff's office received another call. It was a resident of Tallahassee claiming to know who killed Megan and Cherish. The killer was her ex-boyfriend, Robert Neil Rodriguez. This sounded familiar to the investigators, who had lost hope of it being anything other than another scorned ex. So they asked her why she thought he had killed someone. But the woman said he confessed himself. Robert had called her the previous evening and told her everything, convincing her he was serious. He begged her to wait until the next morning to call the police. She kept her promise. One detective thought the man's name sounded vaguely familiar and reviewed the list of people involved in the case. Robert's name was indeed on it because he owned a blue car, though not a Chevrolet Nova, but a 1979 Plymouth Volare, a model very similar to the Chevrolet. The caller couldn't provide any more information, particularly about Robert's current location, but she knew he planned to leave town and was armed. She added that he had previously lived with his mother in Tallahassee, about an hour's drive from Alligator Point Beach. Robert's neighbors confirmed he had moved out of the apartment on May 2nd or 3rd. During the search of his apartment, books on death and other items suggesting a specific, possibly depressed state of mind were found, but no weapon. The police stations around the country were informed of the new suspect's description. Meanwhile, the investigators tried to recall what Robert had told them that caused them to strike his name from the suspect list. But as they began to delve into his past, they were horrified to realize that he was a former police officer from Portland, Oregon. He served in the police force for 2 years, from 1975 to 1977. The officers were shocked because the murderer who committed such a terrible crime could have been one of them. When they approached him about his blue car, he immediately claimed to be a former police officer himself and offered to undergo a polygraph test. But the police stated that it was just a routine check and left him alone. As it turned out, they were wrong. Incredibly, just 8 hours after the woman's call at 6 p.m., the police phone rang again. This time, it was a man introducing himself as Robert Neil Rodriguez. Being a former police officer, he immediately provided his driver's license number to prove it was really him. Then Robert convinced the officer that he was the one who committed the murder. He simply confessed. Robert provided the police with information known only to the killer. For example, the fact that Megan had a towel on her face. He even said he was calling from a payphone on the road in New Mexico, heading to the Grand Canyon National Park, driving his Plymouth. Robert's voice sounded so detached and subdued that detectives feared he might do something foolish. Detectives asked him to surrender to help him, but Robert said it was too late for him and he wouldn't go to prison. He feared that as a former police officer, he would have a hard time in prison. Detectives hurried to find the man, but were also afraid to show his photo in the news. They feared that if Robert's photo appeared in the news, he might do something irreversible, or someone else might take matters into their own hands. The next morning, on May 16th in New Mexico along the route to the Grand Canyon National Park, a blue Plymouth was found on the highway. The license plates on the car were from Utah, but when they checked them, it turned out they had been stolen on May 8th from a parking lot in Utah. The car was just parked on the highway. Inside sat a man who matched the description of Robert Rodriguez. He looked as though he had lost consciousness. A vial with a white substance dangled from a leather lace around his neck, and a handwritten note lay on the dashboard. The note was addressed to anyone who found the man. In it, Robert, confirming it was indeed him, wrote that he had taken cyanide and under no circumstances should anyone try to revive him with artificial respiration, as the rescuer might get poisoned themselves. On the passenger seat was a notebook, where Robert explained in more detail that he had consumed cyanide mixed with scotch for the parents of Megan and Cherish and to avoid imprisonment. There was a gun in the car, but it was a .22 caliber, not the one used to fire the deadly bullets. However, the most intriguing part was that according to Robert's final promise, the Florida police should expect a letter from him detailing how and why he killed the girls. When the parents of the girls heard the news, they were shocked and puzzled. Megan's father wondered, could they have hired a former police officer as a hitman? He couldn't fathom the idea that a stranger could shoot his daughter just like that. He believed it must have been a professional killer. Meanwhile, Cherish's mother, upon learning about the discoveries during the search of Robert Rodriguez's home, wondered if he was a serial killer who hated women. If he was so obsessed with killings, shouldn't he have killed more than 2 people by his age? Of course, at that time, she didn't know how close to the truth she was. And then, on May 18th, the first letter from Robert surfaced. It didn't go to the police, but to a newspaper. In it, he disclosed where the police should look for his body because initially Robert had intended to reach the canyon. He also claimed that he would be sought in connection with 3 committed murders. Incredibly, he admitted that the police themselves wouldn't have been able to link him to 3 murders, but he simply couldn't stay silent. In 1984, he killed another innocent girl, Valerie Hunt. That his 3rd victim was Valerie Hunt. He killed her in 1984, and the police will receive all the details about the murders by mail. Valerie was a 22-year-old student from Tallahassee. Her body was found in September of that same year near the pond. The police initially treated the case as a disappearance, possibly suspecting she had run away, but everyone who knew her didn't believe she would willingly disappear. Her boyfriend reported her disappearance when her boss called to say she hadn't shown up for work, although she was always reliable. Like Megan and Cherish, Valerie went to the pond to swim and sunbathe. She frequented the area often, was a strong swimmer, and it was incredible that she drowned. The cause of her death was undetermined because her body was heavily decomposed. Now, finally, it became clear that she was Robert Rodriguez's first victim. On the 19th, finally, a letter arrived at the police, after which Robert's messages were received by the families of all his victims, his friends, and former girlfriends with whom he had good relationships. The police didn't disclose the details of the message until they had verified every word from the man. They asked the families of the girls to do the same, but Megan's father decided differently. He saw both letters, Megan and Cherish's families, and said they were practically identical, with no hint of an apology in either. Robert revealed the details of how he committed the crime, although Megan's father would have preferred him not to. On March 27th, around noon, Robert entered a cafe near Alligator Point Beach. It was he who ordered a Bloody Mary cocktail and insisted on paying for it. The bartender confirmed this when she saw his picture. He left the establishment around 1 p.m. and headed to the beach. Witnesses who found the bodies passed Megan and Cherish at 1:45, and they were already dead. That is, after leaving the bar, he immediately went to the beach where he saw the girls and killed them. He was haunted by a fantasy in which he raped, beat, and killed a girl. These thoughts had plagued him for a long time, and he couldn't find an explanation or justification for this obsession. And though he dreamed of violence, he assured the police and the girls' families that he hadn't done anything like that to Valerie, Megan, or Cherish. After killing Valerie, he told himself he could live a normal life, and that if he did it again, he would kill himself. And then, when he came across Megan and Cherish, he couldn't hold back. They did nothing to provoke him. He had never met them before but chose them because they were young, attractive, and vacationing in a remote area. It was all over in seconds. He shot Megan first. Cherish began to scream and back away. Then he shot her. Megan had a towel in her hand and it fell over her head when he shot. Then he shot each one more time to make sure they were dead before fleeing. All the letters were written matter-of-factly, and there was practically no emotion in them. It must have been very difficult to read them. Megan's mom again raised the question that worried everyone. How could he harbor this passion for murder for 8 long years before killing again? Megan's father speculated that Robert became engrossed in religion, then lost faith again, and therefore killed again. But investigators noticed another interesting pattern. He divorced shortly before Valerie's murder in 1984. And he had just broken up with his girlfriend before Megan and Cherish's murders. One of his church friends said he sometimes got angry about relationships. Maybe that's how he vented his anger. And his mother died on Easter morning in 1992, and since he no longer had any truly close people, he decided to confess everything. The pastor of his church said Robert was struggling internally. His loving and caring nature fought against the evil inside him. He stuttered about suicide at least twice, and he was taking medication previously used to treat depression, but its effect was linked to aggressive behavior and thoughts of harming himself. When people gathered for service on Sunday, May 17th, and didn't see Robert, they couldn't believe what they had learned about him. They called him Bob, sincerely loved him, helped others, and he wasn't the person they read about in the news. One woman said it was so much like him, warning that he had taken cyanide. Another admitted she wouldn't be able to read news about criminals and judge them as before because she knew one personally. She will think about the people who loved this man because they exist, and she is one of them. It's clear that Robert didn't understand the reason behind his obsession and didn't want to harm innocent strangers. It's unfortunate that he couldn't overcome his inner demons and stop himself before taking the lives of 3 innocent individuals, Valerie Hunt, Megan Carr, and Cherish DeSantis, and breaking the hearts of both their loved ones and his own. Perhaps they first saw each other at the team gathering participating in cross-country running competitions in early autumn of 1995. 2 high school girls from neighboring small towns competing in the 3-kilometer race. No one saw them exchange even 2 words or shake hands, as is customary among competition participants. And why should they? The girls hardly knew each other's names. Their characters and interests were so polarized. One of them, a cheerful, smiling blonde with translucent skin, captivated her classmates. The other, more graceful and petite, mesmerized with an entirely different beauty. Dark hair framed her face like a halo. Her eyes revealed a lively, inquisitive mind and determination. Catching her penetrating gaze made it impossible to look away. The girls had no reason to believe they had anything in common besides running. How could they know that their fates would be forever linked by their acquaintance with a young man, tall, sun-kissed, an aspiring cadet at a military academy? The 2 runners stood at the starting line, awaiting the shot from the starting pistol. It wouldn't be long before they would meet again. On the early morning of December 4th, 1995, a farmer traveling along a country road noticed the body of a teenage girl on the ground behind a barbed wire fence. Initially, it seemed to him that the poor girl had fallen victim to a car accident. Her face was almost unrecognizable. As later became known, she had been struck with something heavy, followed by 2 gunshots to the head. She was wearing shorts and a t-shirt with an inscription that quickly led the police to her school and eventually helped identify the girl. Adrian Jones, a 16-year-old student from the small town of Mansfield, southeast of Fort Worth. The former farming settlement with a rodeo arena and charming antique shops along the main street, Mansfield was one of the last places near Dallas and Fort Worth where the serene atmosphere of a small town still lingered. In 1984, seeking a quiet and peaceful place to raise their children, Bill Jones and his wife Linda, along with their 3 kids, Adrienne and her younger brothers, moved to Mansfield. Bill was captivated by the modest neighborhood where houses stood neatly in rows, their green, lovely yards touching each other, while the voices of playing children echoed through the streets. Bill and Linda raised their children with strictness, especially Adrienne. However, she was never a rebel. She excelled academically and dedicated a lot of time to sports. After a knee injury during a football game, she joined the girls' cross-country team to get back in shape and proved herself to be such an excellent runner that she helped the team qualify for participation in regional competitions in Lubbock.
The restaurant manager where she worked part-time was thrilled with the cheerful and lively employee, as were the customers, especially the boys. There was no shortage of guys interested in dating Adrienne, and it was precisely her sociable nature that made the investigation into her murder so challenging. Typically, when adults are killed, there are no more than 24 people who knew them closely. But a high school girl interacts with hundreds of other kids every day. Detectives quickly realized that Adrienne knew her killer or killers. There were no signs of struggle at the crime scene. Her hands or legs weren't tied. No one had broken into her home to abduct her. Subsequent autopsy revealed that violence wasn't the motive behind the crime. Her death seemed more like an execution, a result of someone's incredible rage, because it takes an extremely cold-blooded person to shoot a familiar girl in the face from half a meter away. Police compiled a list of individuals who might have had a grudge against Adrienne when Bill and Linda Jones reluctantly informed detectives that on the evening of their daughter's death, they allowed her to talk on the phone after the usual 10 p.m. curfew. Her boyfriend, Tracy Smith, was on a trip with his parents and managed to call her quite late. Bill allowed his daughter a few minutes to talk to Tracy. Linda overheard during the conversation that her daughter told Tracy to hold on because someone else was calling. Adrienne switched to call waiting and spoke with someone for a minute before ending the call with Tracy. When Linda asked her daughter who had called, she replied, "Oh, it's David from the cross-country team. He seemed upset about something." After talking with Tracy, Adrienne went to her room but didn't go to bed. Instead, she started ironing her school clothes. Linda recalls that her daughter seemed agitated. She instructed her to turn off the lights and go to sleep. The night passed quietly, except for the fact that shortly after midnight, Adrienne's younger brother heard the sound of a running engine near the house. When he looked out the window, he saw a pickup truck driving away from the house. The next morning, Adrienne wasn't in her room, but her parents thought she might have gone for a run. However, upon finding her sneakers, they grew concerned. Linda called her daughter's coach to inquire if there was a guy named David in the team. "Well, there's David Graham," the coach replied. Linda informed the coach that her daughter was missing and that David might have called her in the evening. The coach was puzzled. She didn't even know that David and Adrienne were friends. When asked if he had called the girl in the evening, David expressed confusion, stating that he had no reason to do so. Investigators also spoke with David, but quickly ascertained that he had no connection to Adrienne's death, so they didn't even propose a polygraph test to him. Firstly, Adrienne's phone book didn't have David's name. Secondly, none of her friends mentioned him. Adrienne's close friends claimed that she shared her most intimate secrets with them, yet none mentioned anything about David. The prime suspect in Adrienne's case became a teenage girl from Mansfield, Tara, who lived in a trailer and had earned a bad reputation in town. A year earlier, she suspected her boyfriend of cheating on her with one of Adrienne's friends. According to police reports, the girl attacked her rival with a baseball bat and wounded her boyfriend with a gun. During the trial, Adrienne testified in favor of her friend, for which the accused vowed revenge against her. Some school students were convinced that this girl was responsible for the murder because she had already demonstrated her capacity for violent attacks with weapons. However, she had a solid alibi and passed a lie detector test. In turn, Bill and Linda suspected their daughter's boyfriend, Tracy Smith, because he didn't attempt to contact the family after Adrienne's murder. The girl's parents didn't know Tracy well. He was a tall football player attending school in the neighboring town of Venus. Apparently, he and Adrienne had met 2 months prior at a diner where she worked. Tracy also successfully passed a polygraph test. However, he provided the police with a new lead. He said that Adrienne told him that during their conversation that evening, it wasn't David who called her at home, but Brian. She mentioned that Brian seemed upset and wanted to meet her that night to talk. Investigators discovered that Brian McMillan worked nearby the restaurant where the girl worked part-time. He had a strong liking for her and would often visit to see her. However, he became so intrusive that when the girl saw him at the restaurant, she would hide behind the counter. Things took a darker turn when investigators found out that the 17-year-old boy was taking 4 types of medications to manage symptoms of depression. During police questioning, he initially claimed not to know Adrienne, then admitted knowing her, but couldn't recall if he spoke with her that night because he had been drinking heavily for the past 6 months. He mentioned feeling sad because all his friends had girlfriends and he felt like an outcast. The police built a compelling case. A young man unable to attract the attention of a beautiful girl finds a way to meet her at night, but loses control. Brian didn't deny the possibility of visiting Adrienne or taking her somewhere. He simply couldn't remember.
On December 15, 1995, the police searched his house, seized his pickup truck, and arrested him, despite his father's claims that his son hadn't left the house that night. After spending Christmas and New Year in jail, the young man underwent a polygraph test, which he passed successfully. Following Brian's release, numerous rumors circulated about the case, but no new suspects emerged. During the summer of 1996, after nearly 300 interrogations, detectives were forced to acknowledge that they no longer had even a single worthwhile lead. Bill and Linda sank deeper into despair. Bill restrained himself from interrogating every teenager he encountered in town. Linda would sit in her car and drive to the place where Adrienne was found at night, hoping to encounter her killer. It seemed that the case would never be solved. Then, suddenly, on August 29, 1996, a lawyer from the military academy in Annapolis contacted the investigators inquiring about any unsolved teenage girl murder cases involving a girl named Adrienne. Naturally, the investigators responded affirmatively, asking for more details. It turned out that 2 female cadets at the academy had made a horrifying statement to senior officers related to a murder in Texas. Their roommate, Diane Zamora, confessed to them that her boyfriend would never cheat on her because they were bound by a murder. Investigators immediately flew to Annapolis, but Diane didn't confess to anything, stating that the story was merely an attempt to gain more respect among other cadets. However, the police didn't stop there. They flew to Colorado to speak with Diane's boyfriend at the Air Force Academy. The young man insisted he didn't know why she would fabricate such a blatant lie. They didn't believe him and continued questioning. David, yes, that same David Graham from Adrienne's cross-country running team at school. The David she allegedly spoke to on the phone on the night of the murder, according to Adrienne's mother. But Stacy said she spoke with Brian, so what was the truth? To find the answer, they needed to delve into the past of David and Diane. David had always intrigued his classmates. With his military-style haircut, straight posture, and excellent manners, he seemed like a person from another era. After witnessing an air show once in his life, David made up his mind to become a USAF pilot and never wavered from his dream. Many girls at school were interested in dating him, but few knew he was already taken. His girlfriend's name was Diane Zamora, attending school in the neighboring town. She was just as intelligent, athletic, and disciplined as David. Every spare moment was dedicated to studying because she dreamed of becoming an astronaut, requiring top grades. Like her boyfriend, she participated in cross-country running competitions. Anyone who saw David and Diane together knew they were destined for a bright future. Their relationship was far more serious than teenage infatuation. In September, about a month after they began dating, they informed Diane's parents that they were engaged. They planned to tie the knot on August 13, 2000, after completing their military education. The wedding was already envisioned. David in uniform, Diane in a white wedding dress, and at the ceremony's conclusion, they would pass under crossed swords held by their cadet friends. Their families were amazed by the seriousness of their relationship, which only deepened over time. David and Diane were so absorbed in each other's lives, almost obsessed. Diane even decided to attend the Air Force Academy alongside David, setting aside her own plans. However, when she missed the deadline for application, she enrolled at the U.S. Naval Academy, intending to transfer closer to her boyfriend later. Upon their acceptance into their respective academies, David and Diane became part of an elite group of American teenagers. Yet, to solidify their place in these prestigious institutions, they had to endure grueling summer training designed to rid them of civilian habits and instill military discipline. For the newcomers, these 6 weeks consisted of constant marching, running, push-ups, and strict adherence to orders. David excelled in basic training in Colorado Springs. According to Diane's letters to her family, she was also doing well in Annapolis. However, her squadron commander, Jay Guild, a likable cadet from Chicago, mentioned that Diane was physically falling behind the others because she always seemed emotionally detached. She kept reminiscing about David, missing him, but spoke about him strangely, as if she didn't trust him yet still wanted to be with him. David and Diane, once completely confident in their commitment to each other, seemed to have lost control of the situation. On one summer day, Jay asked Diane if David had ever cheated on her. She answered yes. When asked what she did about it, she said she asked David to kill another girl. Shocked, Jay listened to the story of how David killed a girl named Adrienne. despite the strict moral principles of the academy, Jay didn't tell anyone about the conversation, for which he later paid the price in his dream of becoming an officer. He claimed he didn't want to believe her and thought the girl was just seeking attention, but at the end of August, Diane repeated her story to her 2 roommates. The girls talked, and one suddenly said that Diane and David were so close that it seemed they would even kill for each other. Diane confessed that they had killed before. Then, either out of guilt or pride, she told them the story about Adrienne. At first, the girls were skeptical about their roommate's story, but the next day, they informed a senior officer. He contacted the academy's attorney, who began calling police stations in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, inquiring about any unsolved murders of teenage girls. On August 29th, they contacted the police in Mansfield, immediately after which investigators flew to Annapolis. Although David tried to deny the accusations, the police managed to find out that his friend held a terrible secret. On the day of Adrienne's murder, David and Diane came to him at night in blood-stained clothes. Then the senior officers of the Air Force Academy told the young cadet that it was his duty to tell the whole truth, and the guy surrendered. He sat in front of the word processor and typed a confession spanning 5 pages. David wrote that on one weekend in November, he went to regional tryouts in Lubbock with other members of Mansfield High School's cross-country team. The school provided them with a large van for the trip. Naturally, Adrienne Jones, a member of the girls' team, also went to the tryouts. In many ways, Adrienne was the complete opposite of Diane. Despite her impressive academic and athletic achievements, she was an outgoing girl who knew how to charm any guy. However, nobody noticed anything between David and Adrienne during the tryouts. They didn't sit together, didn't talk, and as Adrienne's friends claimed, she intentionally kept her distance because she had high moral principles and would never draw attention from another girl's boyfriend. But according to David, something did happen when they returned to Mansfield. David gave the girl a ride home, but they didn't go straight to her house. They parked behind the elementary school where they spent some time together, enjoying each other's company, a brief but fatal adventure for this story. It was an impulsive mistake, and for a month after that night, David was plagued by guilt and shame. His perfect and pure relationship with Diane was tainted by one girl who stole our purity. Finally, he confessed everything to Diane. For at least an hour, she screamed so much that he was afraid for her. She screamed that she wished he never existed, that Adrienne never existed, then screamed that he should kill her. David hardly expected anything like that, but he agreed to fulfill her demand. After Diane's ultimatum, I hesitated long and hard to commit the crime. I was stupid, but I was in love, he wrote in his confession. David admitted that he called Adrienne on the night of December 4th, 1995, and told her he wanted to meet. He picked her up in a Mazda Protégé belonging to Diane's parents. Diane hid in the back. Parking the car on a remote road, the two attacked the girl. Diane hit her with David's dumbbell, but Adrienne managed to escape through the window and ran away. Panicking, David grabbed a 9mm Marikov pistol and ran after Adrienne. When it was all over, the two left. The only thing they said to each other was a confession of mutual love. Then Diane's thirst for revenge suddenly faded, and she said they shouldn't have done it. The young killers went to David's friend, who lived in the neighboring town of Burleson, and tapped on the window. In blood-stained clothes, they climbed into his room through the window. As David's friend recounted, David begged him not to ask questions. It was obvious that both David and Diane were extremely upset. They cleaned themselves in the bathroom, then lay down on the floor and just held each other tight. Initially, David's friend did not report the incident to the police, and David and Diane returned to their normal lives. In the spring, they learned that they had been accepted into educational institutions. David was admitted to the Air Force Academy, and Diane to the Naval Academy. On the attic of David's parents' house, the police found weapons and several dumbbells confirming David's confession. After that, it was Diane's turn to make a statement. Her version of events fully coincided with David's words. In her notebook, the police found an entry, December 4th, Adrienne, 1:38 a.m., and in the parents' car, the blood of the deceased girl. She was placed in a cell. She looked like an innocent girl in a sleeveless shirt and blue jeans. She continued to do push-ups and squats and asked her mother to bring her textbooks so she could study. For the abduction and murder, David and Diane faced the possibility of the highest punishment. However,
Adrian's parents believed that the loss of one young life was sufficient and requested the prosecutors to insist on a life sentence. The young individuals were tried separately, and their lawyers promised to pin the blame on the other defendant. Although initially it seemed that David and Diane would never agree to this because they promised that nothing would ever come between them. Diane broke this promise initially. However, she failed to persuade the court that David committed the crime, and she had no involvement. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. The trial against David concluded in a similar manner. However, during the hearing, a witness emerged whose testimony had the impact of a bombshell. The girl had attended the regional cross-country meet with Adrian and David. After returning to Mansfield, supposedly when David dropped Adrian off home and allegedly cheated on Diane, it was this witness who actually drove Adrian home. Astonishingly, apart from a few of Adrian's closest associates, no one ever questioned David's words regarding his connection with the girl. Although this statement didn't influence the verdict, it became entirely perplexing why David confessed to Diane about infidelity that never occurred. In interviews after the trial, he affirmed that there was nothing between him and Adrienne. He simply wanted to make his girlfriend jealous. If he retracted his words, she simply wouldn't have believed him. This story shook the entire country. The shocking truth left everyone astonished at what was happening with the best and brightest youth in the country. How did David and Diane convince each other that only death could erase the stain from their pristine teenage love? How could they think that infidelity was a far worse crime than murder? Various thoughts were expressed. David's lawyer believed that his client wrote the confession to protect Diane, and some investigators agreed, believing that Diane had an influence on David, compelling him to fulfill all her desires. Others believed that David, who introduced weapons and infidelity into Diane's life, once wholly dedicated to studying, made her his accomplice in a heinous crime, binding their fates forever. There was also the police's third theory that David, wanting to prove he didn't love Adrienne, fired one shot, while Diane, consumed by rage, fired the second. However, these are just speculations, so it remains only a matter of conjecture. Would they have become criminals if they had never met? Carrie Swenson probably learned to ski before she could walk, but she could never have imagined that biathlon would become her life because for women, this sport simply didn't exist before. Finally, in 1983, women were allowed to compete in biathlon, despite many of them enduring years of rigorous training. The USA team missed the first Women's European Cup but participated in the first Women's World Championship in Chamonix, France. The 22-year-old American, Carrie Swenson, started with the traditional 10 kilometers race. She finished fifth right after the Soviet athletes who were considered unbeatable leaders in the sport. In the 5 kilometers sprint, she was the best among her teammates, securing the 13th position. However, the real triumph for the team and personally for Carrie came in the relay. The Americans took the third place, and Carrie and her teammates became the first medalists from the USA. After the biathlon season ended, Carrie returned home to Montana, where she planned her perfect summer. She got a job at a popular tourist ranch called Lone Mountain Ranch and spent all her free time trail running in the backcountry. Carrie opened the window, letting the fresh night air fill her bedroom. This morning, she graduated from Montana State University, receiving her degree in microbiology. After the ceremony, her parents threw a party, celebrating both her graduation and her brother Paul's 21st birthday. They had only one last summer at the Lone Mountain Ranch in the Big Sky area to practice and enjoy the mountains as they did in their childhood. One more year of competitions, and then she would leave to study veterinary medicine, a dream she had since she was 5 years old. Carrie turned off the light in her room and happily drifted into sleep, unaware that her dreams would soon be shattered by the selfish plans of two recluses. Carrie had no idea about the conversation between the two men that took place in the mountains, several kilometers away from her. The younger man didn't hide his irritation. He generally enjoyed living away from people and their rules, but he felt lonely in the mountains and longed for female company. "Dad, do you remember the plans we discussed about getting ourselves a woman?" The father looked carefully at his 18-year-old son and asked, "Do you think the time has come?" In response, the son nodded confidently. On Sunday, July 15th, Carrie went for a run around Elray's Lake. She chose this route because Bob Sharp, the owner of the snack bar where she worked, had told her that he had seen a grizzly bear in the area, and she was eager to see it herself. As usual, Carrie ran fairly quickly, focusing on her breathing. Only at the last moment did she notice two men ahead of her. The strangers looked unkempt, they were not smiling, and the younger one had his hands on a pistol and a knife. Rifles were lying near a tree, even though the hunting season had long ended. Without taking their eyes off her, the men made Carrie realize that they had no good intentions. Unfortunately, she noticed them too late to turn around and run back. Fear triggered an adrenaline rush in her blood, and Carrie sprinted forward even faster, trying to pass the strangers as quickly as possible. However, her plan failed. The older man jumped right in front of her on the trail and grabbed her wrist. Not giving her a chance to react, he grabbed her other hand. Unable to break free from their grip, Carrie decided to rely on her wits and remain calm. The wild look in the older man's eyes frightened her. "Stay calm, don't provoke them," she thought. "Please, let me go," she said. "No, we don't come across pretty girls like you very often. We want to talk to you. What's your name?" he asked, holding Carrie even tighter. He began asking her various questions about whether she was married, who she lived with, and so on. Realizing that she wouldn't be released easily, Carrie tried to scream, but the man quickly silenced her. The stranger released her left hand, only to strike her in the face and then tie her up with a rope. The men said they would keep her with them for 4 or 5 days, and if she didn't like life in the mountains, they would let her go. However, from their smirks, she understood that they were more likely to take advantage of her vulnerability and eventually kill her. "It's just a nightmare," she repeated to herself, hoping to wake up at any moment, but the pulsating pain in her wrist and face indicated that it wasn't a dream. Carrie tried to appeal to their reason, explaining that her family and friends would look for her. In response, the older man threatened to shoot anyone who tried to rescue her. The men hurried on, wanting to move farther away from the lake and into the forest where they wouldn't be noticed. Carrie had no choice but to allow them to drag her along on the rope. Pretending to be submissive, she discreetly memorized the surrounding area to ensure she wouldn't run in the wrong direction when she got a chance to escape. The men walked side by side, chatting casually, as if kidnapping girls was an everyday occurrence for them. They discussed their views on society, laws, and the mountains. The older man expressed dissatisfaction with the region's development, particularly the fact that farmers were allowed to graze their livestock on his land. He told the younger man that he could learn everything necessary for life without returning to formal education or obeying society's laws. Such conversations made Carrie realize that her captors were likely mentally unstable. In an attempt to slow down their movement, Carrie asked for water and claimed she needed to rest. The men agreed to take a break. They approached a swamp, and to her horror, Carrie watched as the older man began drinking water from it. She tried to warn him about the dangerous bacteria present in the swamp, but he dismissed her concerns, saying it was the first time he'd heard of it. Reluctantly, she took a few sips as well. She noticed that the kidnappers behaved less aggressively when she pretended not to fear them. Carrie started cautiously questioning them about how long they've been living here without knowing about the dangers of drinking water from the local swamp. They replied that they were relatively new to the area but had been living in the mountains for 12 years. The younger man added with a smirk that they were desperately in need of female company, making Carrie feel even more uncomfortable. Afterward, they continued on their way. Carrie tried to step on soft ground and break twigs to leave clues for her family and friends who would search for her. Unfortunately, the older man noticed her efforts and thwarted them. Nevertheless, since she had nothing to lose, Carrie stubbornly kept leaving marks, and the older man kept erasing them. They continued this way, and when Carrie checked her watch, She realized that no one had started looking for her yet. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Meanwhile, Carrie's friend and colleague, Alan Goldstein, who taught shooting to guests at the ranch, began to wonder why her run was taking so long. He was afraid that she might have encountered a bear or twisted her ankle and couldn't make it back home on her own. Meanwhile, the strangers continued to lead Carrie further and further away from the ranch. After discussing how far they needed to go, they asked her if she could walk 60 kilometers in a day. She chose not to answer, revealing her capability of running 50 kilometers in hilly terrain during training to her captors was out of the question. If they thought she was weaker than she really was, they might move at a slower pace. She had no doubt now that they wouldn't let her live. Not now, not in 4 or 5 days. They wouldn't sacrifice their precious freedom for her. Carrie continued to subtly study the men. They not only shared a common philosophy but also bore a striking resemblance to each other. She started suspecting they were father and son. Carrie knew that people would soon start looking for her, but the thought of her parents or friends falling victim to her captors was far more terrifying than anything she had experienced so far. One way to avoid this was to escape. Since pleading didn't work, she decided to change tactics. Her tennis coach used to say, "Change your tactics when you're losing." Why continue playing a losing game when you have the opportunity to change your strategy? Around 5 p.m., the men decided to take a break for the night, but not before chaining her to a tree, severely limiting her chances of a possible escape. Mosquitoes and black flies were having a feast, with Carrie as their main dish. She was exhausted, hungry, thirsty, fearful for her life, and now chained. Near the tree, she noticed several rocks, one of which could be used to break a link in the chain at night. It was time to try the new strategy. Carrie decided to become unbearable. "Hey, I'm tired of standing by the tree. Loosen the chain so I can sit down," she demanded. The men looked bewildered but allowed her to sit. With her eyes closed as if resting, she secretly tried to reach for the rock. Unfortunately, the younger man noticed her attempt and removed all the rocks she could reach. Around 8 p.m., she continued to act obnoxious and demanded feminine items as she was freezing and being driven mad by the mosquitoes. The younger man, whom the older one called Dan, gave her a shirt and socks, and the older man started talking about how they had many of his ex-wife's things in the underground caves where they live. He went on about how cozy those caves were and that they would never be found there. Carrie heard a voice in the distance. Unfortunately, her captors heard it too. Simultaneously, a plane appeared in the sky. Carrie didn't know if the plane was searching for her, but the men got alarmed and quickly extinguished the campfire. They clearly didn't expect someone to search for the captive so soon. After circling the forest for about an hour, the plane flew away. With dread, Carrie awaited the upcoming night and what they would do to her. However, they left her to herself while sitting silently by the smoldering fire. As night fell, they provided her with one sleeping bag while they lay in another. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, the concern of Carrie's colleagues grew. 2 hours after she was supposed to show up for work, they started searching for her. Friends and family members of Carrie divided into 4 teams, each tasked with combing through their assigned areas. Carrie's father, Bob Svensson, got in touch with a friend who was a pilot to ask for help flying over the forest. Bob Sharp informed him about the possibility of Carrie encountering a grizzly bear on that trail, which filled him with dread. The teams searched for several hours, calling out her name as they combed the areas where Carrie was likely to run, but as darkness fell, they had to suspend the search. Carrie's brother, Paul, found their father at the ranch after he returned from the airstrip. His father looked pale and restless with worry. Paul needed some time alone, so he asked his father to let him know as soon as there was any news about Carrie and went to his room. He quickly took a shower and lay down on his bed. Suddenly, he saw Carrie. She was tied to a log like some kind of captive animal. The men were sitting around a campfire nearby. His sister was crying. Paul woke up from this horrifying nightmare, not understanding what it could mean and hoping that it was just a bad dream. With the dawn, they would resume the search and they would surely find her. In the morning, the captors decided to move the camp to a different location, but to Carrie's surprise, they only shifted it about 50 meters from the original campsite. Despite the ongoing search for her, Dan didn't hesitate to go hunting with his firearm, shooting a squirrel for breakfast. While Dan was preparing breakfast, the older man demanded that Carrie hand over her shorts, stating that their bright red color attracted too much attention. He took them and went back to the old campsite. This presented an opportunity for Carrie to talk to Dan alone. She tried to persuade him to let her go back to her family, telling him that he was too young for such crimes. Dan looked at her attentively, with no hint of a smile, concern, or regret on his face, and said, "No, you're cute, and you'll stay with me." Meanwhile, the second kidnapper returned and gave Carrie her shorts, stained with soot from the previous campfire. Trying to hold back tears, Carrie started putting on the shorts inside her sleeping bag. She was almost done when she heard rustling in the bushes to her right and saw a person lying flat on the ground. Dan quickly got up and drew his gun from its holster. Carrie shouted, "Stay back. Don't come any closer. They're armed and they'll shoot." "Shut her up," the older man ordered, grabbing his rifle. "Go away. They'll kill you," Carrie shouted again when suddenly a deafening sound echoed, and she was thrown backward. The searing pain pierced her chest, and she smelled the gunpowder. Dan repeated in shock, "I didn't mean to shoot her. I didn't mean to." Incredibly, Carrie thought she had been shocked just at the moment when rescue was so close. The kidnappers made no attempt to help her, but from the bushes to the left, another person emerged. It was another ranch employee, Jim Schwalbe. Apparently, he didn't realize that the kidnappers were criminals and assumed they were part of a rescue team trying to help Carrie, possibly scaring off a bear but accidentally hitting her. Jim rushed towards Carrie, dropping his backpack on the ground. It was only then that he saw the chain around her waist under the sleeping bag and began to understand the truth. He demanded that the older man remove the chain from Carrie, while he continued to be threatened with the rifle. Dan threw his gun to the ground and took out the key to the chain. Jim then addressed one of the kidnappers, Alan Goldstein, telling him to run for help. But apparently, Alan had already figured out their true nature. He shouted that he was armed and ordered the kidnappers to surrender because they were surrounded by 200 people. At that moment, Dan violently yanked the chain, and Carrie screamed in pain. When Jim turned to look at them, the older man aimed the rifle at Alan. "No," Carrie gasped. A shot rang out, and everyone heard something fall in the grass. Jim rushed to the fallen friend, but the kidnapper had already disappeared from sight. The older man reloaded the rifle and aimed it in Jim's direction, but he was too far away by then. The kidnappers quickly packed their belongings into their backpacks, took the chain, and even dumped Carrie out of her sleeping bag, stating that she wouldn't need it anymore. They made no attempt to help Carrie or Alan, leaving them both lying on the cold ground. Carrie heard the crackling of Alan's radio but didn't dare hope to reach it as he was lying too far away. The cold penetrated her entire body, and with her last bit of strength, she attempted to crawl towards the extinguished fire. Lying on her stomach, she tossed some twigs and leaves towards the fire, hoping that there were still warm logs that could help the leaves catch fire. Carrie tried to blow on them, but she was too weak and lost consciousness. When she woke up, she felt an army of black ants rushing towards her blood-soaked shirt. "No," she shooed them away. These insatiable insects reminded her of her thirst for life. She needed to find the radio and help Alan, but he had fallen too far away. However, she noticed Jim's backpack nearby. Her frozen fingers refused to cooperate, but finally, she managed to unfasten the backpack and found a water bottle, a chocolate bar, and a sleeping bag inside. The radio was not there. Carrie managed to put her legs into the sleeping bag and, finding some warmth, opened the water bottle. It turned out to be warm lemonade, and she took a sip and nibbled on the chocolate bar. Carrie once again tried to get closer to Alan, but this time she had to drag the sleeping bag along with her. She couldn't help but feel like a caterpillar crawling on the ground and imagined how her brother Paul would react to that image. He would probably laugh and cheer her on at every step. She chuckled at the silly thoughts that come to mind in such moments. About 1.5 kilometers from the shootout site, other search teams continued their efforts, unaware of what had happened. Suddenly, Jim Schwalbe interrupted them. Gasping for breath, he shouted to the people surrounding him, there were 2 guys. They tied Carrie to a log and shot her when she yelled at us to stay away. Bob asked him if she was alive. She was when I ran away, but that scoundrel shot her, and the old man got Alan in the head. With every breath, life was leaving Carrie. Breathing became incredibly difficult, exacerbating the bleeding. A decision came to her intuitively. She closed her eyes and found herself back on the biathlon track. Biathletes practice their breathing technique methodically, just like speed and accuracy. Carrie focused, and very slow breathing, almost like in yoga, allowed her to slow down her heart rate and bleeding. Annoying flies buzzed around her, but strangely, they helped her stay conscious. She thought about Jim. He should have brought help by now, unless he ran into the kidnappers again. After a few hours, that annoying buzzing sound returned. Carrie looked around in search of the source and spotted a helicopter hovering above the treetops. It paused directly over her, and people were peering out of it. "Please, find us quickly," she silently pleaded. The helicopter flew away, but suddenly she heard the cracking of branches and the sound of a radio. "Help," she cried out with all her remaining strength. "Here she is," someone shouted. "We found her." "Are you okay, Carrie? Can you hear me?" asked a man. "Yes," she replied. She wanted to shout, scream, thank them for finding her, but all she could manage was a smile. Her eyelids felt heavy as if filled with lead, and it was hard to see what was happening next. While Carrie was being taken to the hospital, the police put all their efforts into finding her kidnappers. Little did they know it would be the beginning of a months-long search. The local forests and mountains cover hundreds of kilometers, and no one knows them better than the 2 fugitives. Over the course of 5.5 months, the kidnappers managed to elude the police successfully, and the media romanticized their image, calling them mountain men from another era. They portrayed Ran as a handsome prince and the other man as stern and loving father. It even reached a point where a local businessman wanted to sell T-shirts with their images. Meanwhile, the journalists overlooked the victims of their crimes. Then, about 2 weeks before Christmas, Sheriff Johnny France received an unexpected tip-off. One of his relatives noticed smoke on his ranch property in the woods. France had grown up on that ranch and knew every inch of it. It was dark, the radio had intermittent signals in the mountains, and the criminals could disappear at any moment. Nevertheless, the sheriff rushed to their camp. "Why did I go there alone? Because that's what I was paid for," he joked years later. He arrived as quickly as he could on a snowmobile, tracked down the father and son, and had them in his sights. The father immediately pulled out his rifle and threatened to shoot. In response, the sheriff warned that 2 shots would be fired at his son. He had to use the boy as leverage to get the father to listen. The sheriff convinced them that they could finally warm up, eat properly, and take a shower, which worked. Within minutes, the situation was fully under the sheriff's control. The kidnappers, Dan Nichols and his father, Don Nichols, were arrested and charged with kidnapping. Don was also charged with the murder of Alan Goldstein. At the trial, it was revealed that the men had planned the kidnapping several years ago. Dan refused to live in the mountains without a woman, and since not every girl would agree to their way of life, about 5 to 6 years ago, Don Nichols purchased a chain for his future bride. He dreamed of founding his own clan, living away from society, and Carrie was destined to play the role of the mother to his son's future offspring. Don was sentenced to 85 years in prison, but he was released in 2017. Dan was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but he only served 6 years. It seemed that the young man had turned his life around, getting married, getting an education, and deciding to help disabled people. However, in 2012, he was arrested again in connection with illegal substances. As for Carrie, she spent 8 days in the hospital, and immediately after being discharged, she began pushing the boundaries of her own physical abilities, overcoming pain to speed up her recovery. By 1986, Carrie had recovered enough to participate in biathlon competitions in Oslo, Norway. She achieved a 4th place, but the athlete who finished 3rd invited her to stand with her on the podium, acknowledging her merits. To others, it might have seemed that she had fully recovered, but Carrie knew that the kidnapping and injury had left a lasting mark that would never disappear. She continued to experience pain from scar tissue and the bullet shrapnel still lodged in her body, affecting nearby nerves during significant physical exertion. As a result, she decided to quit competitive sports and focus on a career as a veterinarian, heading to study in Colorado. Today, Carrie Swenson works as a veterinarian in Bozeman, Montana, and continues to enjoy outdoor activities, which she has loved since her early childhood. She rarely talks about the events that happened and has become a harsh critic of the media's coverage of the kidnapping. In particular, she found the romanticizing of the kidnappers and murderers as rugged mountain men skilled in wilderness survival to be inappropriate. She also believed that the media significantly downplayed the emotional trauma of the abduction, portraying the experience as more romantic than it truly was in the hands of the mountain people. In 2012, when Dana was arrested again, Carrie wrote an article for the local newspaper, mocking the so-called mountain men. The Nicholses may have lived in the mountains at times, but they couldn't survive there, at least not without theft and robbery, often leaving the woods for months and buying modern equipment. In the end, they were so easy to catch because they froze, starved, and grew tired of mountain life. They are no true mountain men, she wrote. On March 5, 2018, the medical staff at a hospital in San Diego, California, was awaiting the arrival of a 28-year-old patient named Brigida. She was being transported by an ambulance from her family doctor's office. On that day, Brigida called her mother, Olga, complaining of feeling unwell. Olga struggled to get her into the car. Brigida could barely breathe, and her legs trembled with excruciating pain. With just one look at the once vibrant and healthy young woman, the family doctor knew that Brigida was in critical condition and there was nothing he could do for her. Therefore, he called an ambulance to take her to the clinic. The emergency department medics were also alarmed that they might not be able to stabilize the patient's condition. Brigida was in unbearable pain, could hardly see anything, could barely speak, and had no sensation in her feet or hands. But the most puzzling symptom was that her once beautiful chestnut hair was falling out in clumps. The doctors began their work. They quickly determined that there were no external signs of trauma on her body. No bruises, wounds, or indications of infection. The cause of her illness was internal. Brigida's mother explained that her daughter had been suffering from sudden episodes of nausea, fatigue, and excruciating pain for several months. The symptoms would occur suddenly without any warning, causing her to spend days in bed. Brigida could barely take care of herself, let alone her husband and young son. Various specialists she consulted were at a loss, unable to understand what was afflicting her. Her symptoms did not match any known illness. One doctor even told her that her case was how critical days manifest. Finally, the doctors concluded that it was a result of stress and prescribed her tranquilizers. However, her condition worsened, her body was failing, and the medical staff in the emergency department of San Diego understood that if they didn't figure out what was wrong with her as soon as possible, the patient could die within days. Brigida grew up in California, just a few kilometers away from the border with Mexico. Her father worked at the customs between Mexico and the United States, while her mother took care of their 2 daughters, Brigida and her younger sister Olga. The girls grew up in a loving and caring family. Brigida happily attended a Catholic school, excelling in her studies. Her friends described her as the friendliest and kindest girl they knew. Brigida had a passion for running and even participated in competitions representing her school. It was through running that she met her future husband, Race Remington Uto. They met in high school. Race attended a different school but was also passionate about sports. At first, Brigida's family didn't pay much attention to their friendship because their daughter wasn't interested in dating boys. Her time was consumed by studying and sports. However, gradually, the young couple became more and more involved with each other and started dating. Race managed to bring out a more adventurous side of Brigida, and soon they became inseparable. Race had a highly ambitious goal. He dreamt of attending the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. The acceptance rate for students was less than 8%, making it a challenging task. The applicants had to excel in school, work on personal development, engage in sports, participate in community life, engage in volunteer work, and much more. Surprisingly, Race managed to gain admission to the academy, and he moved to Maryland to begin his education. The young couple continued their relationship long distance. However, after some time, Race was diagnosed with a hernia that didn't resolve completely. He had to leave the academy but found work as an electrician in the Navy. Meanwhile, Brigida pursued her own plans and became a teacher. In 2014, after 7 years of being together, 25-year-old Brigida and 24-year-old Race got married. Soon after, they welcomed their son. Brigida believed she was perfectly happy with everything in her life going according to plan. She had a loving, caring husband, a wonderful child, and lived just steps away from her parents. However, her life would soon take an extraordinary and painful turn that she could never have imagined. Among the emergency department physicians at San Diego Hospital, there was a certified toxicologist named Dr. Jeff Lapointe, which was considered rare. He was a true medical detective, and like an excellent detective, Lapointe followed the trail of clues that could lead him to understand what was happening to Bridget. Was she being killed by an autoimmune disease? No, blood tests did not confirm that. Could she be suffering from cancer? No, although one symptom stood out among all others. Hair loss was not due to the disease, but rather a result of therapy. All the symptoms indicated that Bridget had been exposed to a toxic chemical. But which one and how? Was it arsenic, cadmium, or cesium? No, because these heavy metals wouldn't result in hair loss. However, there was one substance that could: thallium. In the early 20th century, thallium was used as a depilatory agent. It was also actively utilized by doctors. For example, if a child had head lice, thallium was applied to their head, causing the lice to fall off along with all the hair. In subsequent years, thallium became the main component of rodent poisons. However, by the 1970s, its popularity as a murder weapon, alongside arsenic, had increased to the point where it was banned for sale and use. All of Bridget's symptoms, including leg pain, weakness, deteriorating vision, loss of appetite, weight loss, and, of course, hair loss, indicated thallium poisoning. The problem was that Dr. Lapointe couldn't confirm his suspicions quickly. Nobody in the hospital had encountered such a case before, and there was no way to test the patient for poisoning. The samples had to be sent to another laboratory, and the results would be available in 3 days. 3 days that Bridget might not have. The race against time had begun. Lapointe started calling all the agencies, requesting an expedited analysis. But even if the doctor's suspicions proved to be correct and Bridget was suffering from thallium poisoning, the antidote would be urgently needed. However, obtaining the antidote, poetically named Berlin Blue, turned out to be more challenging than he could ever imagine. We have all seen Berlin Blue because it is a blue pigment used in paints. Vincent van Gogh used it when painting Starry Night over the Rhone. This substance is also an antidote for poisoning by certain heavy metals, accelerating their elimination from the body. However, while you can buy blue paint at the nearest art supply store, obtaining medical-grade Berlin blue is almost unrealistic. Lapointe called all the pharmacies, naval medical officers, clinics, but he found the antidote only at one warehouse, a classified warehouse in Los Angeles. The thing is, Berlin blue is also an antidote for radiation exposure, such as in the case of a dirty bomb explosion. Therefore, the government keeps meticulous records of every tube of Berlin blue in the country. And Dr. Lapointe couldn't count on getting the antidote until thallium poisoning was confirmed in the laboratory. When the toxicological analysis of Bridget's case arrived, Lapointe's worst fears were confirmed. The level of thallium in Bridget's body exceeded the permissible limit by 1,000 times. A hospital staff member drove all night to bring the antidote to San Diego. However, the doctor feared that with such a severe poisoning, one antidote might not be sufficient. He prescribed dialysis for the patient to cleanse her blood. It was a slow and painful process, and now all the medical staff and Bridget's family could do was wait and pray. Meanwhile, Bridget's husband and son were placed in another wing of the hospital to monitor their health. If she had been exposed to thallium, they could have been affected too. The main question remained, where could she have obtained such a large quantity of thallium? And the answer to that was being sought by FBI agents. It should be understood that all this was happening in a state with several military bases. Furthermore, these events unfolded against the backdrop of President Trump's planned visit. Therefore, when Dr. Lapointe started looking for Berlin blue, the FBI agents became very interested in what was happening in the city. FBI agents and police have discovered that several months ago, Bridget underwent treatment at an alternative medicine clinic in Mexico when she began experiencing an unexplained illness. The police investigated this lead but ultimately dismissed it. The school where Bridget taught was a former military base during World War II, where rodent poisoning could have occurred in the past. In that year, many teachers at the school fell ill. However, this lead also turned out to be a dead end. Investigators could not dismiss the possibility that Bridget had used thallium herself as a cry for attention due to her depression. But everyone who knew her claimed that she loved life and would never abandon her son. Furthermore, her depression emerged after the appearance of unexplained symptoms, not the other way around. Dr. Lapointe had his own suspicions about how his patient had been poisoned. He conducted a scan of Bridget's internal organs and was horrified to discover numerous white spots throughout her digestive tract. It became evident that the poison was entering her body through food. Someone close to her had attempted the perfect crime. Dr. Lapointe ordered complete isolation for the patient, allowing no one to visit her or provide her with food except what was provided by the hospital. However, at that moment, food was the least of her concerns. Bridget regained consciousness thanks to the antidote after a few days. All her hair had fallen out, and she couldn't sit or move, but she was alive. She couldn't name anyone who would wish her harm. However, the police knew that poisoning is always a personal crime committed by a close friend or family member. It was also interesting that Bridget's husband and child were unharmed. The police spoke with her sister, parents, and husband, all of whom were eager to help with the investigation. Ray wept and lamented that he couldn't switch places with his wife to relieve her suffering. He said what the detectives wanted to hear, yet investigators sensed falsehood in his words. The medical staff also noted that he didn't seem as concerned and asked strange and sometimes inappropriate questions. Response to the suspicion regarding her husband's involvement, Bridget became angered and vehemently denied it. She insisted that Ray had been caring for her when she was unwell, taking care of their son and bringing her to the hospital. Furthermore, he would prepare meals when she lacked the strength to get out of bed. However, during the conversation with Bridget, the investigators learned something that sent chills down their spines. Ray had a rather unusual hobby. He enjoyed collecting rare seeds of poisonous plants. This piqued the police's interest, and after 16 days of Bridget's hospitalization, the police gathered enough evidence to search their home. Ray opened the door and appeared somewhat agitated. The detectives asked him to hand over all the family's gadgets, and he willingly surrendered all the phones and laptops. However, he couldn't help but notice that all the search histories on the devices had recently been cleared. Despite the supposedly deleted data on his phone, the police found 2 books in Ray's mobile, Criminal Poisoning and The Poisoner's Handbook. According to the Poisoner's Handbook, thallium gives the poisoner the ability to control how quickly their victim dies. The poisoning presents itself as a medical enigma, with the patient slowly deteriorating for unknown reasons. There were even more intriguing discoveries. In Ray's car, they found a canister of acetone and a packet of exotic seeds hidden in a small compartment in the spare tire. Additionally, Bridget's sister handed over a black garbage bag that she retrieved from the trash bin, as their mother noticed Ray throwing it away just before the police arrived. Inside were receipts for exotic seeds such as tick seed, crea nut, and Cerbera odolum, along with various tools for their filtration and grinding. In other words, everything necessary for the production of rare poisons. It was evident that the man had already attempted to crush tick seeds to obtain ricin, a poison toxic to mice but dangerous to humans if inhaled or ingested. The detectives' suspicions grew, but there were no traces of thallium found in the house, garage, or car. Therefore, there was no basis for arresting Ray. All they could do was share their suspicions with Bridget and ask her not to return home. She still couldn't believe their words, but she didn't object to the continuation of the investigation. The investigators continued to dig deeper and discover the possible motive for the murder. Ray had a lover who believed he was a widower. He lied to her, claiming to be a Navy SEAL and expressing his goal to work for the FBI in the poisoning division. He didn't hesitate to bring his young son on their dates, and the boy had grown so attached to the woman that he called her mom. Leading a double life, Ray went even further and started another affair, confessing to the woman that he was married. However, he hoped that his wife would be hit by a bus, so he wouldn't have to share custody of their son. It's unclear why this didn't alarm the woman. Nonetheless, it was clear that the man wanted to end his relationship with Bridget. But as a devout Catholic, she had warned him before their marriage that she did not believe in divorce and that if they married, it would be for life. She could hardly have expected her unfaithful husband to take this ending so literally. The detectives asked Ray to undergo a polygraph test, which he failed miserably. When the polygraph examiner informed him of the results, he didn't attempt to deny it and confessed to everything. Race stated that he ordered thallium online 3 times. In August 2017, he first attempted to add it to his wife's food by preparing her a sandwich for breakfast. He calculated the amount of thallium based on her weight. The next day, Bridget felt unwell, but it didn't kill her. She started to recover. In December of the same year, Race added a slightly larger amount of thallium to the soup. Again, he didn't achieve the desired effect. In January, he increased the dosage 5-fold and once again hid the poison in a sandwich. He intended to kill Bridget within days. She felt terrible, experienced excruciating pain, and began losing her hair, but she continued to fight for her life. After confessing, Race was arrested. 8 months later, he pleaded guilty to 3 attempts to murder his wife. His lawyer tried to argue that Race suffered a spinal injury while serving in the Navy, and the pain clouded his judgment. However, this defense did not help. On March 14, 2019, he was sentenced to 3 life imprisonments ranging from 21 years to life. He may be eligible for parole in October 2033. If he is lucky and succeeds in his first attempt at freedom, he will serve only 14 years in prison and become a free man before his 42nd birthday. During the trial, Bridget was finally able to address her husband personally. She said, "I wanted to believe that I knew the man I married 3 years ago, the man I had been dating for nearly 10 years. I wanted to believe that he would never harm me. I am horrified by the thought that he could be responsible for attempting to kill me. How could you do this to the mother of your child? Why do you think you have the right to decide that I am not a worthy mother for your son? How could you decide that the way to end our marriage is by slowly killing your wife, watching her suffer for months? I cared for you and I loved you. Every time Bridget recalls the incident, she breaks into a cold sweat. She felt unwell and was lying in bed. Her husband brought her a sandwich with peanut butter. Their little son climbed onto the bed and asked for a bit. Race immediately shouted at her not to give him any. Bridget doesn't know if there was thallium in that sandwich, but she believes her son was at least on the brink of severe poisoning. Despite Bridget's reluctance to admit divorce, she eventually divorced Race. She still suffers from constant fatigue, weakness in her legs, and nerve damage. However, she is gradually recovering and has returned to work at a school for children with special needs. She admits that now it is much easier for her to find an approach to each student. Bridget, who once couldn't walk, is now running again, trying skydiving, and striving to live life to the fullest.